Okay, so, what if Ned Stark didn't keep Jon Snow? What if instead of raising him as a bastard in Winterfell, he handed him to Daenerys Targaryen, 6 weeks old, on a beach in the dark, and said, "Keep him safe."
The ship smelled of salt and rot and something beneath both, the particular stink of fear that clings to people who have lost everything and are not yet sure they will survive the losing. Daenerys Targaryen stood at the stern rail and watched Westeros disappear. She was 13 years old. She had been a Khaleesi and lost it. She had been a mother and lost it. She had walked into fire and walked out again, and still she had lost. The continent shrinking behind her in the gray morning light was not a home she was leaving. She had never had a home, but it was the shape of everything that had been taken from her, and watching it go felt like watching a wound close over something still lodged inside. She held the baby tighter. He had been placed in her arms 4 hours ago on a dark Dornish shore by a man she did not know, a northerner with a quiet face and grief in his eyes so deep it seemed structural. Like the grief had been there so long it had become part of how he was built. He had said nothing she could repeat later. He had wrapped the infant in oilskin against the sea spray, pressed him into her arms, and walked back up the beach without looking back. As if looking back would have undone him, the child was perhaps 6 weeks old. He had dark hair which surprised her. She had expected Targaryen silver and gray eyes that watched her with the unsettling focus of a creature that had not yet learned to pretend. He did not cry, he watched. "What do I call you?" she asked him. He watched. "Eamon," she said. It came out before she had decided on it. Her great-great-uncle's name, a name that meant faithful. She didn't know why it felt right, it simply did. He watched her with his gray eyes, and she pulled the oilskin tighter around him, and the coast of Westeros completed its disappearance, and the ship sailed east. Illyrio Mapates received them in pentos, with the particular warmth of a man who sees opportunity wrapped in the shape of a favor. His manse was enormous, cool in summer, full of the kind of extravagant comfort that made Daenerys feel obscurely watched even in private. She had been here before, briefly, at the beginning of everything, before Drogo, before the Khalasar, before she understood that Illyrio's hospitality was always a form of investment. She knew better now. She accepted his rooms and his wet nurses and his cooks and his tutors, and she smiled at his dinners, and she did not trust him. But she also had nowhere else to go and an infant who needed feeding every 2 hours, and so she smiled. The wet nurses lasted 3 days. Dany hadn't expected to care so much. She had been given to understand, by whom she couldn't say, perhaps by the general air of expectation that had surrounded her entire life, that high-born women did not nurse their own children. That wet nurses existed precisely so that mothers could remain available for the political work of being a mother without the inconvenient biological reality of it. She had accepted this arrangement. She had placed Eamon with the wet nurse, a gentle woman named Lyra, and walked away to bathe and sleep. She had made it approximately to the door before she turned around. "I'll do it," she said. Lyra blinked. "My lady, I'll do it." Dany said again and sat back down and held out her arms, and that was the end of that. Later, months later, a year later, in the small hours when Eamon was finally sleeping and she was awake beside him with nothing between her and her own thoughts, she would try to understand it. She had lost Rhaego. She had lost him before he was born, in the truest sense lost him to a curse she had invited into her own tent. That grief was a country she could not leave, only learn to navigate. And here was this child, not hers by blood, not hers by any claim she could articulate, and something in her had simply refused to put him down. Perhaps that was it. Rhaego had been taken from her before she could hold him. Eamon was here, solid and warm, and watching her with his unnerving gray gaze, and some part of her that was more animal than queen had made a decision that no other part of her was consulted about. She was his mother. That was simply what was true now. Illyrio's household ran on the schedule of a man who had never needed to be anywhere urgently. Mornings were slow, evenings elaborate, the days between them given over to commerce and gossip, and the maintenance of alliances that Daenerys was not yet important enough to be told about. She used the time to learn. She had always been a reader. Viserys had at least given her that, the habit of books if not the patience for them himself. And Illyrio's library was extensive in the specific way of a collector who acquires things to possess them rather than to understand them. She read Valyrian history. She read military theory. She read accounts of sieges and naval engagements and the management of conquered territories, absorbing it all with the focused hunger of someone who believes they will need it. Eamon, propped against a cushion beside her, watched her read. "This is the history of our family," she told him when he was old enough to sit up on his own, which was apparently very early, according to Lyra, who had been retained as a nursemaid after all. "The Targaryens ruled for nearly 300 years. We came from old Valyria, which was the greatest civilization the world had ever seen, and we survived its destruction because our ancestors had the wisdom to leave before it fell." She paused, and because they had dragons. Eamon reached for the page. She let him touch it. "We'll have dragons again," she told him. She believed it absolutely. She had 3 petrified eggs and the certainty of someone who had walked through fire. "And when we do, everything will be different." He looked at her with his gray eyes, serious and attentive, and she thought, not for the last time, that he seemed older than he was. Not precocious exactly, more as though he were paying very careful attention to something she couldn't see. Ser Jorah Mormont arrived in Pentos when Eamon was 2 years old, looking like a man who had been following the wrong star for long enough that he'd forgotten what the right one looked like. Daenerys recognized him from the brief, strange days before her marriage to Drogo. He had been among her brother's small retinue of hopeful exiles, a big Westerosi knight with a bare sigil and a manner that suggested he'd been ashamed of himself for some time before she'd met him. She knew, vaguely, that he had been spying on her for Varys and Robert Baratheon, and that his conscience had eventually caused him to betray his spymasters at a critical moment and save her life. She was uncertain how to hold both of these things, the betrayal and the redemption, at once. He knelt in Illyrio's receiving hall, which seemed to cause him some physical pain, and said, "Your Grace, I have no right to ask anything of you. I ask only to serve." Daenerys looked at him for a long moment. Eamon, standing at her knee and watching Jorah with the same careful attention he gave everything, said, "He's sad." Jorah looked at the small dark-haired boy, startled. "He is," Dany agreed. "Sir Jorah, this is Eamon. He will be honest with you whether you want him to or not. He gets it from me." She considered. "You may stay, but I will have your complete honesty always on everything. Can you give me that?" Jorah met her eyes. "Yes, Your Grace." "Then get up. You look ridiculous on the floor." She gave him the task of training Eamon because Jorah was the only person in the household she was reasonably sure would not teach the boy to be reckless. Jorah Mormont was many things, but reckless was not among them. He taught through consequence rather than rule, showing rather than explaining, correcting mistakes with the calm patience of a man who had made enough of his own to be philosophical about them in others. Eamon took to it with a seriousness that occasionally worried Dany. "He doesn't play," she said to Jorah one evening, watching Eamon in the training yard below, running the footwork drills he'd been given with the methodical focus of a much older student. "Other children play, he practices." "Some people are built that way," Jorah said. "He's not unhappy. He just takes things seriously. He's 4. He's 4 and he knows he's living in exile in a foreign city being trained by a disgraced knight for reasons no one has fully explained to him, and he has decided that the right response to that situation is to be as prepared as possible for whatever comes next." Jorah was quiet for a moment. "In my experience, that kind of mind either becomes very great or very lonely, sometimes both." Daenerys watched her son. She had stopped qualifying it even in private thought, run his drills in the amber afternoon light, and felt the complicated love of a mother who can see something in her child that she cannot yet name. He asked about his father when he was 5. They were eating breakfast, a small, ordinary meal at a small, ordinary table, one of hundreds of such meals they had shared, and he looked up from his bread and said, "Where is my father?" Dany had prepared for this. She had prepared carefully, had worked out the shape of a story that was true enough to hold under scrutiny, the story of a noblewoman who had loved unwisely, who had died in childbirth, whose family could not keep the child for reasons of politics and survival. A story with no sharp edges, no specific names, no thread that could be pulled. She looked at Eamon and the prepared story evaporated. She could not lie to him. She had not realized this about herself until this exact moment, and the realization had the quality of discovering a load-bearing wall by walking into it. She could not lie to him cleanly. She could withhold, she did withhold. She withheld everything she didn't know and everything that would hurt him and everything that might one day be a weapon in the wrong hands. But looking at his gray eyes across the breakfast table, she found she could not construct a false story and place it in front of him like a gift. "Your father was a man who loved your mother very much," she said. This was true, she believed it to be true. "And your mother died before she could raise you herself. She was brave, and she was good, and she wanted better for you than the circumstances she'd been given. This was also true," she suspected, "and a good man brought you to me because he trusted me to keep you safe and raise you well." Eamon absorbed this. "Did you know my mother?" "No." "Did you know the good man who brought me to you?" "No." He was quiet for a moment, processing with the particular thoroughness she had come to recognize. Then, "But you know who they were." She looked at him steadily. "I know some things." "Not everything. Will you tell me when I'm older? I'll tell you what I can when the time is right." He accepted this. Not without reservation. She could see the reservation, the careful filing away of the question for future retrieval, but he accepted it and went back to his bread, and she breathed out slowly. "You are mine," she told him, because she needed him to know that above everything else. "Whatever else is true, that is true. You are my son, and I am your mother, and nothing changes that." He looked up at her, and for a moment he had the expression of a child who has been carrying something heavy and been given permission to put it down. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to know about before." The eggs hatched, not when Eamon was 5, not at any particular moment of drama or crisis. They hatched in Dany's bedroom on an ordinary night in his 6th year, in the slow hours before dawn, and Dany woke to warmth she could feel through the sheets and stumbled out of bed to find 3 small dragons, no larger than cats, scaled and perfect and impossibly alive. Climbing over each other in the remains of their shells, she stood very still for a long moment. Then she sat on the floor, which was not particularly queenly, but was the right response to having your deepest certainty become real, and she put her hands out and the dragons came to her. She did not realize she was crying until Eamon appeared in the doorway, woken by some noise, or perhaps by the warmth, or perhaps by whatever sense he had that always seemed to know when she needed him, and crossed the room without hesitation and sat down beside her on the floor. "They're real," she said. "Yes," he said, "they're actually real." He leaned into her side, the way he had since he was very small, and she put her arm around him. And the 3 dragons explored the floor around them with the cautious curiosity of creatures discovering existence for the first time, and the warmth in the room was extraordinary. And Daenerys Targaryen felt, for the first time since V's Dothrak, perhaps for the first time since before Drogo, as though the story was moving in the direction it was supposed to go. She named them. Drogon for her son. Regal for Rhaegar, the brother she had never known. Viserion for Viserys, the brother who had been terrible and broken and had loved her in the only ways he could. Eamon watched her name them with great seriousness. When she came to Regal, something passed across his face that she noted and then filed away, a brief, strange intensity quickly suppressed like a candle flame touched by a draft. "Can I touch them?" he asked. "Be careful." He reached out slowly, his small hand flat and patient. Regal, the green one, the one whose scales caught the light like hammered bronze in some angles and like deep river water in others, stretched its neck and pressed its head against Eamon's palm. Dany watched. The dragon did not bite him, did not flinch away. It simply held its head against his hand with the satisfaction of an animal that has found what it was looking for. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself dragons were strange creatures, and Eamon was a child she had raised, and they knew his smell and his warmth and the particular quality of his presence that she had come to rely on without ever cataloging. She told herself this, and mostly believed it and tucked the moment away. The years settled into a shape. Illyrio's manse, then a smaller house they rented with Dany's own funds. She had some carefully maintained, the remnants of what Viserys had not sold and what she had quietly accumulated through the sale of a gift here, a jewel there. Managing the small economy of exile with the focus of someone who knows that money is autonomy. She wanted distance from Illyrio's investment, from the feeling of being a piece on his board, and the distance, even if small, helped Eamon grew. He was never large, he had a lean, compact build that would not change much through his life, but he grew precise, economical the way Jorah had taught him to be. He was not a natural fighter in the sense of someone for whom it came easily. He was a natural fighter in the harder sense. He understood that skill was a thing you built, and he built it steadily, without complaint, without vanity. He was also, Dany discovered, deeply funny in a way that surprised people who expected a child of her household to be solemn. Not performing funny, not trying to make you like him funny. Observational, dry, occasionally devastating. He would say things that made Jorah inhale his wine and then look genuinely puzzled by the response, and then, slowly, allow himself a small private smile when he understood. He read everything she gave him and much she didn't. History mostly, and military theory, and the occasional piece of philosophy that he would bring to her with genuine questions. Not the questions of a student seeking approval, but the questions of someone working through a problem and wanting another mind on it. He was 8 years old and asking her what the difference was between justice and vengeance. Why, she asked. Because in the histories they're mostly treated as the same thing when the winning side does it, he said. But they can't be the same thing, can they? She thought about it. No. But the line between them is harder to hold in practice than in theory. Where's the line, I think, she said slowly. It's whether the punishment serves the future or only satisfies the past. He thought about this for a long time. That would mean most of the executions in the books are vengeance. Yes, including ours. He didn't say the Targaryens, but she heard it. Including ours, she agreed. He looked at her with his gray eyes, and she thought, he's going to be remarkable, and it is going to be a complicated thing to watch. Missandei came later, not yet, not until a stapper, but the structure of their small household solidified around these years in Pentos. Dany, Aemon, Jorah, 2 household guards she trusted, Lyra, who had become more family than servant. They moved twice more, always to slightly better houses, always with slightly more security, as the dragons grew and Dany's resources and reputation quietly accumulated. The dragons were the great fact of their life. They were not pets and they were not weapons yet. They were forces of nature that happened to live in their courtyard and periodically set the roses on fire. Drogon was enormous almost immediately, aggressive, loud, the kind of presence that made horses hysterical at 100 yards. Viserion was gentler, curious, drawn to Dany with a devotion that had something almost canine about it. Rhaegal was the strange one. Rhaegal went to Aemon. Not exclusively, the dragon would accept Dany, would come when she called, would eat from her hand. But there was a preference that became visible as the dragons grew large enough for it to matter. Where the other 2 arranged themselves around Daenerys like planets around a star, Rhaegal arranged itself around Aemon. When Aemon was in the courtyard, Rhaegal was near him. When Aemon trained with Jorah, Rhaegal watched from the wall with the focused attention of a creature that understands a fight is happening and is deciding whether to intervene on its favorite's behalf. Jorah pretended not to notice. Dany noticed. She constructed explanations. The dragon had been named for Rhaegar, and there was something in Aemon's blood, some Valyrian trace from whoever his father had been that resonated with that name, that connection. Dragons were strange. Magic was strange. She was herself proof that the world contained more strangeness than the Meisters catalogued. She was not ready to ask the question the evidence was building toward, so she filed the evidence away and loved her son and raised her dragons and planned the war that was always, the direction everything was pointing. When Aemon was 9, she caught him in the courtyard at dusk, sitting on the ground with his back against Rhaegal's side. The dragon was asleep, or something like asleep, that slow-breathing deep stillness dragons fell into between activity and alertness. Aemon was reading, not studying exactly. Reading for pleasure, the particular relaxed quality in his shoulders distinct from the focused posture he took with military history. She sat beside him without announcement, which he accepted the way he accepted everything she did, as simply a fact of his world. "What is it?" she asked, nodding at the book. "Songs," he said. He showed her the spine, faintly embarrassed. A collection of northern ballads that had somehow made it into Illyrio's library, probably as an acquisition of no particular interest, a curiosity of Westerosi folk tradition. "Songs," she repeated. "The North has good ones," he said, and there was something in his voice that she recognized as the tone he used when he was saying something true that he hadn't expected to be true. About the cold and the dark and the things that used to live beyond the wall. They're different from the Valyrian ones, less about power. What are they about? He thought about it. Endurance, he said finally, mostly about enduring. He was 9 years old and sitting against a dragon reading northern folk ballads, and Dany felt the complicated love again. the kind that contains both pride and grief, and the particular ache of watching someone become a person you couldn't have predicted. Regal breathed slowly beside them, warming the evening air. "Eamon," she said, "whatever happens, whatever comes next, however far we go, and whatever we have to do to get there, I need you to know that having you is not something I regret." She paused because this was harder to say than the versions she'd rehearsed, which had been tidier. "I didn't expect you. I didn't know I needed something to love that wasn't a plan or a cause or a throne I hadn't reached yet. And you are that. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the courtyard wall, Pentos went about its evening business, indifferent and alive. "I know," he said. "I feel it." He looked up at her. "You don't have to be afraid, I don't know." "I'm not afraid," she said. He gave her the small private smile. "Yes, you are." "A little." She laughed, which startled Regal into a sleepy rumble, which made them both laugh harder, and the evening held them there for a while longer before the world called them back to it. The road east was always ahead of them. The dragons grew, Eamon grew, Daenerys planned. But for now, in the last ordinary years before everything accelerated into history, there was the courtyard and the lamplight and the smell of the sea and a boy who read northern songs against a dragon's side. And a woman who had learned, later than most, in the hardest school available, that some things are worth more than thrones. The question was whether, when the time came, she would be able to act on that knowledge. The time was coming. East always east, until east became west, until the sea became home and home became a place she had never been. Eamon would be there when she arrived. He always was. The slave markets of a stapper smelled like the end of something. Eamon was 10 years old the first time he walked through them, and he did not look away. He had been told to stay at the ship. Dany had been specific about it, her voice carrying the particular tone that meant she was not asking, and he had agreed with the particular tone that meant he had already decided otherwise. Jorah had found him at the dock gate, trying to look like he belonged there, which a 10-year-old Valyrian-looking boy in good clothes could not manage regardless of effort. "She'll be furious," Jorah said. "I know, she'll have a reason to be furious." "I know that too." Jorah looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Stay beside me," and walked him through the gate. What Eamon saw in the next hour changed the architecture of something inside him. Not broke it, he would think about that word later and reject it, because breaking implied damage, and this felt more like construction, like a wall going up around something that had been exposed. He saw men and women and children in chains. He saw the way the slavers moved through the market with the ease of men in their own home, touching and inspecting and pricing, and the way the enslaved people held themselves, not broken exactly, not defeated, but adapted, which was worse. The self-protective shrinking of people who had learned that visibility invited pain. He didn't speak. He walked beside Jorah and looked and did not look away, and by the time they reached the plaza where Daenerys was negotiating with the slave masters in their ridiculous robes, something in him had calcified into a position he would hold for the rest of his life. Dany saw him from 30 yards away. Her eyes found him with the unerring accuracy they always had, the mother sense that she wore lightly but that had never once failed. She finished what she was saying in Valyrian. Then she crossed to him and crouched to his level, which she still did despite the fact that he had been informing her for a year that he was too old for it, and looked at him very carefully. "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said. Then, "No, I'm angry." "Good," she said quietly. "Hold on to that. Don't let it make you stupid, but hold on to it. Are you going to free them?" "I'm going to free all of them." She said it simply, without theater. "Everyone," he looked at her. She was 23 years old, and had 3 dragons and an army she was in the process of acquiring, and the absolute certainty of someone who has decided to move a mountain and is currently identifying the right tools. He loved her so completely that it sometimes felt like a physical pressure behind his sternum. "How?" he asked. "Come to the council tonight," she said. "I'll show you." She showed him. The council in those days was small and mobile. Jorah, Barristan Selmy, who had joined them in Pentos with the apologetic gravity of a very old knight who has waited too long to do the right thing, and Daenerys herself, who ran her councils the way she ran everything, with complete command dressed up as consultation. She wanted advice she hadn't thought of, not endorsement of what she'd already decided. It made her counsels short and useful. Eamon sat in the corner with a cup of water he didn't drink and listened. The plan for a stapper was elegant in the way that plans are elegant when they depend on the other side underestimating you. The Unsullied were the finest infantry in the known world and could be purchased with one dragon. Dany had agreed to trade Drogon, but Drogon would respond only to Daenerys, and Daenerys had no intention of remaining traded. The moment the chains passed to her hand, she would use the Unsullied to kill the masters, free the slaves, and take Drogon back. The trap depended on the masters believing her to be the kind of woman who could be sold and bought. Men like the masters of Astapor had been making that mistake about women like Daenerys for a very long time. Aemon listened to all of this and waited until the older men had spoken and then said, "What about the slaves who aren't unsullied?" The room looked at him. He had learned not to feel self-conscious about the looking. He was the Dragon Queen's son, which made him either a distraction or a useful provocation depending on the context, and in councils it was usually the latter. "What about them?" Barristan asked, not unkindly. "The plan frees the Unsullied because they're the mechanism of the plan, but there are tens of thousands of other slaves in this city. What happens to them when the masters are dead and the Unsullied are free?" Silence. "The practical kind, the kind that means we had not gotten there yet." "They'll be free," Jorah said. "Free to do what? They have no food stores we control, no weapons, no established leadership. The city's economy will collapse overnight. If we march out with the Unsullied and the freed slaves have nowhere to go and nothing to eat, we've handed them a different kind of death." Daenerys looked at him. He recognized the expression, not surprised by what he'd said, but by the speed and completeness of it. "What would you suggest?" She asked, and she was actually asking. That was the thing about her that mattered most. She asked, and then she listened to the answer. "We stay longer than planned," he said. "We organize the food stores before we leave. We identify community leaders among the freed people and establish some kind of provisional governance before we march. We take volunteers who want to join us and help the rest build something that doesn't collapse when we leave," Barristan said. "That adds weeks to the timeline." "Yes." Aemon agreed. "There are 2 other slaver cities, I know, but if we free Astapor badly, we teach the other cities what to prepare for, and we leave behind a catastrophe that follows our reputation east. If we free it well, we teach them something different. And people in Yunkai and Meereen who are enslaved will know that our freedom is worth having." Another silence, longer this time. Jorah, who rarely looked surprised. Daenerys said, "We stay," and that was the end of the debate. Astapor fell in an afternoon. Aemon watched from a rooftop, which was where Dany had consented to him being, visible but not in the fighting itself, a compromise they had negotiated in the tense hour before it began. Rhaegal circled overhead, keeping pace with him as the dragon always did now, a fact that the Unsullied had quietly begun treating as normal without discussion. The masters died quickly. The Unsullied were extraordinary, not because they were vicious, but because they were precise, which was a different thing entirely, the difference between violence as punishment and violence as solution. Aemon watched the red-robed figures fall and felt the anger from the marketplace still in his chest, cold and usable. He did not enjoy watching men die. He had been afraid he might, afraid that whatever was in him, the capacity for the kind of focused cold clarity he'd discovered in himself in Jorah's training yard, might turn out to be something darker than discipline. But watching the masters fall, he felt nothing like satisfaction. He felt the grim, mechanical relief of a problem being resolved. That distinction seemed important. The pyramid came last. The great masters surrendered it badly, with the bluster of men who had never genuinely believed this could happen to them. And Daenerys received their surrender from the back of Drogon with the composed patience of someone who has all the time in the world and none of the pity they're hoping for. That evening, Aemon sat in the plaza where the slave auction blocks had stood that morning and watched freed people move through the city with the cautious wonder of people testing the texture of something they'd been told not to touch. He sat quietly and let people approach him or not approach him, and several did, children mostly, drawn by the novelty of a boy near their age sitting still in the middle of everything. A girl, perhaps 8 years old, sat beside him without asking and looked up at the darkening sky where Rhaegal was a green shape against the first stars. "Is that yours?" she asked, in Valyrian with an Astapori accent. "He thinks so," Aemon said. She thought about this. "What does it feel like?" He considered being diplomatic about it, and then considered that she deserved an honest answer and said, "Like having something very large decide to love you. It's terrifying and wonderful at the same time, mostly wonderful. She watched Regal's circle. I never thought I'd see one. You'll see a lot of things you haven't seen before, he told her, starting now. They spent 4 weeks in a stapper. It was, as Barristan had said it would be, longer than planned. It was also, as Eamon had argued it would be, worth it. Provisional councils were established from among the freed population. People who had held organizational roles in the slave hierarchy were recruited into leadership of the replacement structures. A practical rather than idealistic choice that caused some tension, but produced results. Food stores were inventoried and distributed. The Master's treasury was divided between the new council and Daenerys' war chest, with a calculation that Tyrion, not yet with them, that came later, would have approved of on purely mathematical grounds. Dany worked 18-hour days and did not complain about it. Eamon worked alongside her, doing the lower-tier organizational tasks that didn't require a queen's authority, talking to people, taking tallies, carrying messages, the infrastructure of administration that no one thinks about until it isn't happening. He was 10 years old and he had found, to his own mild surprise, that he was good at it. Not in the way he was good at swordsmanship, through effort applied over time, but naturally, in the way of someone whose instincts were calibrated toward people rather than away from them. Jorah watched him work with an expression that had gradually shifted over these weeks, from the watchful assessment of a soldier, evaluating a potential liability toward something quieter and harder to name. On the last evening before they marched for Yunkai, he sat beside Eamon on the steps of the largest pyramid and said, "You're going to be very useful to her." "I want to be," Eamon said. "That's not always the same thing." Eamon looked at him. "What do you mean?" Jorah was quiet for a moment, choosing words with the care of a man who doesn't use them decoratively. "I mean that useful people get used, even by people who love them, especially by people who love them sometimes because they trust that the love will hold regardless." He paused. "She loves you." "That's not in question, but she also loves what she's trying to build, and when those two things pull in different directions, you should know in advance which one is stronger." "You know which one is stronger," Jorah met his eyes. "I think you do too. I think that's why you asked the question about the other slaves, back in a stapper, because you were thinking about what kind of queen she becomes, not just what kind of campaign she runs." Eamon was quiet for a while, watching the torchlight move across the plaza below. "She can be both." He said finally, it was not naive. It was the considered position of someone who had studied the tension between power and goodness for most of his conscious life and believed, against evidence, that the tension was navigable. "Yes," Jorah said, "with help." He didn't say, "and you will spend your life providing it." He didn't need to. They both understood. Yunkai was simpler than a stapper in its mechanism and more complicated in its aftermath. The city was convinced rather than defeated. The sight of 3 full-grown dragons on the horizon produced a pragmatic surrender in the Yunkai slave masters, who were businessmen before they were ideologues and knew a calculation they couldn't win when they saw one. The slaves were freed. The masters were allowed to keep their lives and a portion of their wealth, in exchange for genuinely comprehensive arrangements regarding the welfare of the freed population that Eamon had drafted with Missandei's help over 3 days of careful work. He had met Missandei in a stapper, where she'd been serving as translator. A girl of perhaps 12, with a precise mind and the preternatural composure of someone who has learned to survive by being indispensable. They recognized each other as what they were. People who understood the mechanics of power without being consumed by the desire for it, people who could hold complexity without needing to simplify it first. She taught him High Valyrian in exchange for his teaching her the Westerosi military histories she hadn't had access to. It was an equitable arrangement. They became, in the way of people who share a particular frequency of intelligence, friends with very few words wasted. "You think like a steward," she told him once, which she did not mean as an insult. "Dany thinks like a conqueror," he said. "Someone has to think like a steward." "Does she know that's what you're doing?" he considered. "She knows. I'm not sure she's decided how she feels about it yet." "How do you feel about it?" He looked at the city around them, busy with the complicated transition from one kind of order to another, complicated and imperfect and going better than most people had expected. "I feel like it matters," he said. "Conquering is the beginning. This is the actual work." Meereen took longer. Meereen was the largest of the 3 cities, the most fortified, the most committed to its own continuation. The masters crucified slaves along the road as a message, 163 of them, one for every mile of the road from Yunkai. And Eamon rode that road beside Daenerys in silence and watched her face close around something cold and hard. The iron that lived in her under the warmth and wit, the thing that had walked through fire. Don't, he said quietly. She looked at him. Don't let it become the only thing you feel, he said. You need the anger. But if it's all you feel going into this, they win something even if we win the battle. Her expression was complicated. She was 24 years old and had seen things that had made her both more and less than she'd been, and sometimes the balance between those directions was precarious. He knew this about her better than anyone except perhaps Missandei, because he had been watching her longer and from closer than almost anyone alive. They crucified 163 people, she said. Her voice was entirely level. I know. He held her gaze, and they will answer for it. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking you to punish it correctly, which means with your whole mind, not just with the part that's burning. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, when did you get old enough to say things like that to me? 11, he said. It was a Thursday. The iron didn't leave her face, but something shifted beneath it, something human. They took Myrine in 2 days. The siege itself was resolved, as most of Daenerys' campaigns were resolved, when you looked at the full picture, less through direct military force than through the subversion of the city's internal logic. Daenerys' forces blocked the gates and ports. Dario Naharis, a flamboyant sellsword captain who had recently joined their service with what Eamon privately considered an excessive amount of personal flair, led a small team through the sewers. The city's slave population rose. The masters found themselves between external dragons and internal uprising and chose, with the self-preservation instinct of their class, to yield. The great masters who had ordered the crucifixions did not yield. Daenerys crucified them in return, 163 of them, the mirror of the act. Eamon did not argue against it. He had made his argument on the road. She had heard it and weighed it and made her decision, and a queen's decisions, once made, were her own. He stood beside her when it was done and said nothing and did not look away, because looking away would have been its own kind of statement, and he was not making that statement. Later, privately, he went to the water's edge alone and was sick, quickly and efficiently, and then stood for a while watching the harbor. Jorah found him there. He always did. It was justice, Jorah said. I know. He wiped his mouth. Justice is still hard to look at sometimes. Yes. She'll need to know that, Eamon said. That it's hard to look at, that if it ever stops being hard, that's the moment to worry. Jorah said nothing. He put a hand on Eamon's shoulder briefly, which was the most he ever did by way of comfort, and then stood beside him watching the harbor, and the evening settled around them. And in the morning, the work of building something in the ruins of what they'd broken would begin. He first rode Regal at 12 years old. It wasn't planned. Regal had been increasingly restless in Myrine's pyramid, pacing the upper terraces with the contained energy of a creature whose instincts were being held in check by its attachment to a place. Daenerys was in the throne room dealing with a dispute between freed slave communities and former masters over ownership of a grain storehouse, which was exactly the kind of grinding, undramatic governance problem that actually determined whether the liberation held or collapsed. Eamon had been sent to check on the dragons, which was a task usually assigned to the unsullied handlers who had taken on the role with professional calm. He found the handlers at the bottom of the terrace stairs, not injured but firmly not going any further up. Regal was at the top, making a sound Eamon had never heard from a dragon before, not a roar, not the shriek of aggression, but something lower and more sustained, a vibration that he felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. He went up. Regal turned when he appeared at the top of the stairs and stilled immediately. The sound stopped. The dragon looked at him with that amber-eyed attention that had always felt like being measured against some standard Eamon couldn't see. All right, Eamon said. What is it? Regal lowered its head to the terrace floor. Not in submission, this was not submission, this was invitation, the deliberate lowering of something enormous to meet something smaller at its level. Eamon stood very still. The thing about being 11, nearly 12, and standing in front of a dragon the size of a large horse who is inviting you to climb onto its back, is that your body and your mind have different opinions about what to do next. His body was extremely clear on the subject. His mind was engaged in a rapid and somewhat chaotic review of everything Dany had ever told him about dragon flight. He thought about what she had described, the fire in the blood. The feeling of being recognized. He put his hand on Regal's neck. The warmth was extraordinary. Not hot exactly, not burning, but warm with the deep-down warmth of a living thing, of something that had fire at its center and was choosing to share the edges of it. He climbed up. The takeoff was nothing like he'd imagined, less violent, more absolute. One moment the terrace was beneath him, and then it was not. The city spread out below in the flattening perspective of height, the harbor turquoise and vast, the pyramids diminishing to chess pieces, the surrounding desert enormous and pale. He did not scream. He gripped and breathed and let Regal feel through the grip what he needed. Steady, forward, not too high. Let me see the shape of this before we go further, and the dragon, extraordinarily, adjusted. They flew for perhaps 20 minutes. Long enough for the terror to become something else. Not comfortable, not yet, but workable, the terror that has been renegotiated into respect. When they landed, Eamon sat on the terrace for a moment with his hands loose on his knees, breathing carefully. Regal sat beside him. Not behind him, not watching him from a distance. Beside him, close enough that the warmth was a constant pressure on his left side. He thought about what Dany had told him about the moment she'd hatched the dragons, about the feeling of a certainty becoming real. He thought he understood it now in a way he hadn't before. He was also thinking about what it meant that Regal had chosen him. He had been not thinking about this for 2 years, filing the evidence away, maintaining the mental architecture that let him avoid the question. But here, on this terrace, with the dragon's warmth against his side and the memory of Myrene miniaturized beneath him, the architecture felt less stable. He was not Daenerys's blood. He knew this. She had confirmed it obliquely in every conversation about his origins that carefully orbited the central fact without stating it. He was blood of someone else, someone who also had a connection to dragons. He sat with this for a while. Then he climbed down the terrace stairs and went back to work, because the grain storehouse dispute was not going to resolve itself, and Dany needed the minutes of her day that his help could free. But he carried the question with him from that afternoon forward, quiet and persistent as an ember. Myrene was a grinding thing. Governance always was, and Myrene was governance at its most resistant. A city that had been built on exploitation for so many generations that every structure in it, social and economic and architectural, had exploitation at its foundations. And removing the foundation without collapsing the building required a patience that tested even Daenerys's considerable reserves. The Sons of the Harpy began their campaign of assassination 6 months into her rule. They were former masters and their children and the children of former masters, the people who had benefited most from the old order and lost the most in its passing, and they operated the way all such people operate when stripped of institutional power, in the dark, in groups. Against the most vulnerable of the new order's representatives, freed slaves were killed in alleys. Unsullied were ambushed at night. The city's mood curdled in cycles. Hope when there were no attacks, fear when there were, and always beneath it, the question of whether this new thing was really safer or just a different arrangement of who could hurt whom. Eamon attended every council meeting on the subject and said less than he might have, partly because Barristan and Grey Worm and Missandei had more tactical experience to draw from, and partly because he was working through something he needed to work through before he could speak. At the 7th council meeting in a month, when the debate had circled around to the same positions it always circled to, show more force or show more mercy, the endless pendulum of how to respond to organized violence, he said, "They want us to pick one of those 2 responses. They're designed to make us pick one of those 2 responses. If we increase force, we confirm that the new regime is just the old regime with different winners. If we show mercy, they interpret it as weakness and escalate. Either response validates their strategy." The room looked at him. He had learned to speak into these silences without flinching. "What's the alternative?" Barristan asked. "Make the city not want to protect them," he said. The Harpies' cells work because they have safe houses, people who look the other way, communities that don't report them either out of sympathy or fear. We've been trying to find the cells. We should be trying to find out what the safe houses need badly enough to withdraw protection in exchange for getting it. Missandei said, "You want to use the peacetime governance work as an intelligence network. I want to make the benefit of supporting us clearly larger than the benefit of tolerating the Harpy," he said. Which is not a fast solution, But it's the only one that actually resolves it instead of just suppressing it until we leave. Daenerys looked at him for a long moment. That's the work of years. Yes, he said, we knew that. She held his gaze, he held hers. There was a conversation happening in the space between them that the room could see but not hear, about how long she intended to stay, about whether Myrine was a city to govern or a city to use as a base, about the distance between liberating a place and taking responsibility for what it became after. We knew that, she agreed, finally, and the meeting moved on. The assassination attempt came on a Tuesday. Daenerys was moving between the Great Pyramid and the temple where she had established a community court, the kind of transit that was theoretically secure and practically impossible to make completely safe given the architecture of the streets. The Harpy's cell had 3 people and a rooftop position, and the professional judgment that this was their best opportunity. Aemon was not supposed to be in that street. He had finished his work in the court 2 hours early due to a cancelled mediation session, and was cutting through to the pyramid via a route that happened to place him about 30 seconds ahead of Daenerys' moving guard. He saw the movement on the rooftop by accident. By the kind of accident that is not entirely an accident in someone trained since age 4 by a soldier who instilled the habit of looking up. He moved before he had consciously decided to move. The cell had prioritized the rooftop archer. The 2 figures in the street below were the secondary element, meant to close in once the guard's attention went upward. Aemon came around a corner and was, quite suddenly, standing 6 feet from a man with a curved blade and a mask, and the slightly hesitant body posture of someone who had not expected an obstacle at this stage of the operation. He had a short sword. Jorah had begun giving him a real sword at 11, the transition from training blade managed with Jorah's characteristic pragmatism. You're ready or you're not, and I think you are. He had practiced for 7 years. He had never used it on a person. The man attacked first. What Aemon found in the next 45 seconds was that his training had prepared him accurately for some aspects of a real fight. The mechanics were correct. The footwork held. The transitions between positions were reflex rather than decision. What it had not prepared him for was the weight of it. Not the physical weight of the blade or the resistance of a human body, but the weight of the fact of what was happening, the way time became thick and strange, the way the sound seemed to come from a long distance. The second attacker came in from the left. Aemon took a cut across his left forearm, minor, long, freely bleeding, and did not fall. He would think about this later with the clinical interest of someone trying to understand their own performance. He did not freeze. He was afraid, but he was functional, and the gap between those 2 outcomes was Jorah's 7 years of work. The guards caught up 30 seconds later. The rooftop archer was brought down by an unsullied crossbow before he released. Daenerys came around the corner to find Aemon sitting on the ground with his back against a wall, his left arm held up because someone had told him to keep it elevated, looking at the street around him with the expression of someone reviewing an experience they have not yet finished processing. She crossed to him in 12 steps. She did not run, she moved with the fast, controlled urgency of someone who is not going to let herself run, and crouched in front of him and took his face in her hands and looked at him for a long moment with an expression he had never seen on her before. He would not be able to describe it adequately afterward. It had several components, one of which was terror that had arrived late, and one of which was something so close to grief that the distinction barely held. "I'm all right," he said. "I know," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "Let me look at you anyway." He let her. Later, when the arm had been seen to and the Harpies people had been identified and the full council had assembled for an emergency session, they had the first real fight of their lives together. It was loud enough that Missandei quietly excused herself from the room and stood in the corridor pretending to review some documents, and the unsullied guards stationed outside the door found reasons to look in the opposite direction. "You are not supposed to be in that street," Dany said. Her voice had the quality of something that has been heated and shaped under pressure. "I know. You were supposed to be finished at the 4th hour, not the 2nd. The session was cancelled. Then you come back to the pyramid directly. You don't cut through back streets alone." "If I hadn't cut through that back street—" "That is not the point," her voice cracked briefly. She stopped, pressed her lips together. When she continued, it was quieter and more dangerous. "You could have been killed." "So could you," he said. "That was the plan. You were the target." "I have guards, I have. They were on the rooftop, they would have been looking up, and the street-level cell would have been past them before they recovered. I know because I was there and I saw it. He held her gaze. I'm not saying I planned it. I'm saying I was there and I acted, and the outcome was that you're alive. The outcome could have been that you were dead. Yes, he agreed. It could have been silence. She looked at him with eyes that were fully wet now, which she would not acknowledge, and he looked back at her and did not point it out, because some things are more important than winning an argument. I can't lose you, she said. It came out quieter than anything else she'd said in the conversation, the genuine thing beneath the anger. You won't, he said. Then, because he was 12 years old and had just been in a fight and was more honest in this moment than he might have managed with more composure. You're all I have too. If anything happened to you, he stopped. She pulled him forward and held him with both arms, which she rarely did anymore because he had been asking her not to treat him like a small child, and this time he did not ask her to stop. He held on in return, his bandaged arm awkward between them. After a moment she said into the top of his head, Don't die. Working on it, he said. She made a sound that was either a laugh or the thing adjacent to a laugh that arrives when you have been too frightened for actual humor. She held on a moment longer. Then she let go, straightened, and walked back into the council chamber with the composed authority of a queen, and the meeting resumed, and the work continued. But that evening, alone in his room, Eamon sat with his bandaged arm and thought about what it had felt like. Not the fight itself that he had already processed, in the systematic way he processed most things, filing the lessons. He thought about the moment after, crouched against the wall, looking at the street with its evidence of what had just happened. He had protected her. And protecting her had felt not like duty, not like loyalty. It had felt like the most natural thing in the world, as natural as breathing, as unquestioned as gravity. He was 12 years old and he understood, perhaps for the first time with the full weight of an adult's comprehension rather than a child's assumption, that this was who he was. Not a Targaryen prince in exile, not the Dragon Queen's adopted son performing a role. This was who he was. The question of whose blood ran in his veins could wait. It had been waiting for 12 years. It could wait a little longer. He put out the lamp and listened to Meereen settle into its complicated night, and outside the window on the high terrace above, Regal breathed slowly and kept watch. Meereen taught Eamon that freedom was not an event. He had understood this intellectually before, had argued it, in fact, in that first Astapor Council when he was 10 years old, pointing out that liberation without infrastructure was just a different kind of trap. But understanding something intellectually and living inside its daily reality were different countries with different weather. And 3 years of Meereen's governance had given him a residency in the latter that no amount of reading could have substituted for. He was 14 now and taller, and the cut on his left forearm had become a scar that Jorah said would fade in time, and that had not. He had stopped minding it. It was the first thing that had happened to him that was entirely his own, not a consequence of exile, not a product of someone else's war, but a mark made by a choice he had made. He bore it without pride and without shame, which seemed to him the right relationship to have with a scar. Meereen was exhausting in the particular way of things that are important and resistant in equal measure. The city had stabilized, not thrived, but stabilized, which was its own achievement given where they'd started. The sons of the Harpy had been reduced through the combination of Eamon's slow intelligence work and Grey Worm's more direct methods into something manageable rather than existential. The community courts were functioning. The grain distribution was functioning. 3 of the city's 6 major markets had reopened under integrated management, the mathematics of commerce proving more persuasive to both former masters and freed slaves than any amount of political argument. It was not the story songs would tell. Songs wanted the dragons and the fire and the moment of liberation. They did not want the 3-hour dispute resolution sessions about irrigation rights or the careful negotiation of a new wage structure for the harbor workers, or the question of what to do with the children of the great masters who were themselves too young to have been complicit, but whose inheritance made them complicated figures in a city trying to forget its own structure. Eamon was present at all of it. He had become, without anyone formally deciding this, Daenerys' primary working hand for the governance problems that required sustained attention rather than decisive authority. The problems that didn't resolve in a single dramatic moment, but required someone to sit with them through their grinding complexity and not give up. Missandei was his partner in this, and Grey Worm his pragmatic backstop when the complexity produced people who needed to understand they were not negotiating. He was 14 years old, and he was running large portions of the administration of a city, and if this struck anyone as remarkable, they had the courtesy not to mention it, possibly because there was too much work to do to spare the time for being impressed. Tyrion Lannister arrived in the 3rd year. He came with Varys, which was the first thing Aemon noticed, not because Varys was frightening exactly, though the eunuch had the specific quality of making you aware of the space between what you knew and what you didn't, but because Varys and Tyrion together was a statement. These were not refugees or seekers of fortune. These were chess players who had decided, for their own reasons, that Daenerys' board was the one they wanted to be on. Aemon was present at their first meeting with Daenerys, which he attended not as a council member but as what he actually was, her son, positioned slightly behind and to her left, the place he had occupied in formal settings since he was old enough to stand still through them. He watched the two men with the careful attention he gave to everything new, cataloging. Tyrion Lannister was exactly as the histories described Lannisters. Constructed, confident, armored in wit the way other men armored themselves in steel. He was also, Aemon noticed, watching him back with equal attention, which was either flattering or concerning depending on what the attention was for. Varys watched everyone. The meeting was long, and the conversation between Dany and Tyrion was the kind of conversation that happens between two very intelligent people who are simultaneously assessing each other and negotiating the terms of a relationship. Dense, occasionally combative. Surprisingly honest in the moments when pretense became too expensive. Daenerys was cautious in the way she always was with people whose intelligence rivaled hers. Tyrion was cautious in the way of someone who has learned that his best qualities have frequently made things worse. They reached a provisional agreement by the end of the afternoon. Tyrion would serve as advisor. Varys would do whatever Varys did, which was never entirely specifiable and always somehow exactly what was needed. As the meeting broke up, Tyrion caught Aemon's eye. "You're quieter than I expected." He said, not an insult, observation. "I had nothing to add," Aemon said. "You had several things to add, you chose not to." Aemon looked at him steadily. "The meeting wasn't mine to direct." Tyrion's expression was difficult to read, which was presumably intentional. "How old are you?" 14. "And you run half her administration." "I help where I can." Tyrion studied him with the particular focus of a man whose primary skill is reading people and who has encountered something that doesn't read cleanly. "Your mother speaks of you frequently, more frequently than she may realize." He paused. "You have her stubbornness, the rest of you is harder to place." Aemon felt something tighten in his chest at the word rest. He kept his face still. "I'm not sure what you mean. I'm sure you're not." Tyrion said pleasantly and moved away to accept a cup of wine from a servant, and the moment passed. But it didn't pass, not entirely. It lodged. Tyrion was brilliant and useful and occasionally exhausting in the way of people, who are more comfortable with ideas than with the feelings that ideas produce in other people. He and Aemon established a working relationship within the first month that was characterized by mutual respect and a careful circumference each kept around certain topics. The circumference, on Tyrion's side, was everything he knew about the history of the child who had been sent east. He knew something. Aemon was increasingly certain of this, certain with the bone-deep conviction of someone who has been reading a person's careful avoidances for months. Tyrion knew something, and he was sitting with it, and he had reasons for not speaking. The circumference, on Aemon's side, was the question he had been not asking since he was 12 years old on a terrace with a dragon's warmth against his side. They worked around their respective silences with professional efficiency and did not discuss them. What they did discuss was everything else. Governance theory, military logistics, the specific political landscape of Westeros that Tyrion knew from the inside and Aemon knew only from books and Dany's stories, and Ser Barristan's soldierly reminiscences. Aemon absorbed Tyrion's Westerosi knowledge with the appetite of someone who has been preparing for an examination for their entire life and has just been given access to the primary sources. "The North is the variable no one accounts for properly," Tyrion said one evening. They were on the pyramid's third terrace, the night cool and the harbor lights scattered below them, both of them reviewing logistics projections that Eamon had drafted for the eventual fleet operation. Everyone who plans to conquer Westeros thinks of the north as a minor consideration. It's cold, it's thinly populated, it doesn't produce much of anything that makes southern lords wealthy. But the north is the variable. Because of the Starks, Eamon said. Because of the Starks and because of what the Starks represent. The North doesn't follow the Iron Throne because of obligation. It follows whoever holds the Starks' loyalty, and the Starks' loyalty is not like other houses. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. It's ideological. They believe in certain things, duty, honor, the specific northern version of justice, and they hold to those beliefs with a stubbornness that has caused them no end of political difficulty over the centuries. Eamon was quiet, reading his projections without reading them. "Tell me about Eddard Stark," he said. Tyrion looked at him sideways. "Why? I want to understand the North. There are living Starks who could tell you about him better than I can. Tell me what you know." Tyrion studied him for a moment. "Ned Stark was the most honorable man I ever met." He said at last, which is both a compliment and an explanation for most of the worst things that happened to him. He was completely incapable of performing a dishonesty, even when it would have saved his life. He loved his family, passionately, more than most men of his station would admit, and he was the kind of man who keeps secrets not because he's calculating but because he's decided the secret is the only way to protect the thing he loves. He paused. He was also the man who found the bodies at the Tower of Joy. The Tower of Joy, the name was in the histories, in the fragments of Rhaegar's story that Eamon had assembled from half a dozen sources, none of them complete, all of them careful. The Tower of Joy was where Rhaegar had kept someone. Where someone had died, where something had ended and something else had perhaps begun. He kept his face still. "What was at the Tower of Joy?" he asked. His voice was entirely neutral. Tyrion turned to look at the harbor. He was quiet for long enough that Eamon became certain he was going to deflect. "A woman," Tyrion said, "and a promise that Ned Stark kept for 16 years at enormous personal cost." He set down his wine cup. "I don't know the full content of the promise. I know it was kept. I know it cost him his wife's trust and possibly his marriage happiness, and I know he kept it anyway." Another pause. "I've always wondered what kind of man does that? What kind of man carries something like that in complete silence for the better part of 2 decades? A northern man." Eamon said. "The northern man," Tyrion agreed. The conversation moved on. Logistics and fleet projections and the question of which Westerosi houses might be approached before the fleet sailed. They worked for another hour and then parted for the night. Eamon went to his room and sat at his window and looked at the harbor and did not sleep for a very long time. Tower of Joy. A woman and a promise. A northern man who kept it for 16 years. He was 14 years old and he was not ready to pull the thread all the way. But he could see now, clearly and with a completeness that had previously been blurry at its edges, exactly how far the thread went and what it was attached to. He sat with it in the dark. Then he put it away, carefully, in the place where he kept things he was not yet ready to face, and went to sleep. The thing about Daario Naharis was that he was genuinely skilled, which made him more annoying rather than less. Eamon had no particular objection to Daenerys taking a lover. She was 25 years old and had the same capacity for loneliness as anyone. More perhaps because her position made genuine intimacy complicated. But Daario's style of being skilled grated in the specific way of people who wear their abilities as ornamentation rather than tools. He was performatively brave. He was decoratively charming. He approached everything, including warfare, with the aesthetic sensibility of someone who wanted to be watched doing it. He also looked at Daenerys in a way that Eamon did not examine too closely, because examining it produced an emotion he suspected was not entirely appropriate for a son to have about his mother's romantic attachments. "You don't like him," Missandei said. She was not asking. "I don't trust him." Eamon corrected. "Is there a difference?" "Yes, I don't like a lot of people I trust. Daario I find personally tolerable, but professionally, he's loyal to her because she's extraordinary and because serving an extraordinary person is more interesting than the alternative. That's not the same as loyalty to a cause or a principle. When the extraordinary person becomes ordinary or inconvenient or less interesting, you think he'd leave." "I think he'd leave," he paused. "Which is fine, he's a sellsword, it's structurally appropriate. I just don't want her to mistake one kind of loyalty for the other." Missandei considered this. Does she? Eamon was quiet. I don't know. I think she knows the difference. I think she lets herself not know sometimes because she's lonely. Missandei looked at him with the expression she had when she was deciding how honest to be. You protect her from a lot of things, she said finally. She knows you do. I wonder sometimes if she knows how much. She's the one doing the actual work of ruling a city. I'm just... You are the person she talks to when she's afraid, Missandei said. You are the person she argues with when she wants to think through something she's not ready to say aloud to her council. You are the person she asks for when the bad news comes in the night. She paused. Don't tell me you're just helping with logistics. He looked at her. I'm her son. Yes, Missandei said. You are, and that's not a small thing. Dario was sent away the year Dany decided to sail for Westeros. The decision itself was not sudden. It had been building through 2 years of Tyrion's counsel and Varys' intelligence reports, and Daenerys' own increasingly restless reading of the political landscape across the narrow sea. But the timing of it, and the conversation that preceded it, were sharp. Aemon was not present for the conversation with Dario. He was present for the one after it, when Dany came to find him on the terrace where he was working and sat across from him and said, I've sent him away. He looked up from his papers. I know what you thought of him, she said preemptively. What I thought doesn't matter. It matters to me. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the sky, where Regal was a distant green shape against the late afternoon blue. He wanted to stay. He argued. He was eloquent about it, actually. A brief smile that had something painful underneath it. He said that a man who stays is worth more than a man who follows, and he's not wrong. He's not wrong, Aemon agreed, but he can't come to Westeros. He's a sellsword with a reputation and no political standing, and he'd be the wrong answer to every question people would ask about my judgment, and I need those questions answered correctly when I arrive. She paused. I know what I'm doing. I know you do. I'm not asking for your approval. I know that too. She looked at him then, fully, the way she did when she was done with the surrounding conversation and wanted to say the actual thing. I'm telling you because I don't want to have not told you. Because you would have noticed and not asked, and that would have been, we don't do that. We don't not ask. He held her gaze. We don't not ask, she nodded. Then, are you ready for Westeros? He thought about the question seriously, because she always meant her questions seriously and deserved answers to match. I don't know what ready means for a place I've never been. It means, do you want to go? It means more than that, he said. It means, do I want to help you take it? She was quiet. Yes, he said. Completely. Something in her shoulders settled. Good, she stood. We have 6 weeks of loading and provisioning, and I want you on the logistics coordination for the fleet. Tyrion will work the political planning with me, and you can cross-check his math on the alliance approach. He's brilliant, but he assumes people are more rational than they are. They're considerably less rational than he assumes, Aemon agreed, which you know because I've been in mediation sessions with freed slaves and former slave masters for 3 years, and people will choose dignity over advantage almost every time if the choice is presented clearly. That's a useful thing to know about people. It's the most useful thing, he said. She almost smiled. Fleet logistics, 6 weeks. Don't let Dario's quartermaster leave with more than his contract specifies. He'll try. And then she was gone, back into the work of dismantling one life and preparing to sail into another, and Aemon turned back to his papers and began making lists. He killed a man for the second time 2 weeks before they sailed. It was nothing like the first time. The first time had been emergency and reflex and the thick, strange time weight of genuine violence. This was an execution. One of Daenerys' household guards had been identified. Through the intelligence network Aemon had spent 2 years constructing as an informant for the sons of the Harpy's remnant cells. Not a soldier, not an ideologue. A man with debts and a sick child, and the particular desperation that produces betrayals not from conviction, but from arithmetic. He had passed information about Daenerys' movements. The information had been used in the planning of at least 2 assassination attempts, one of which had nearly succeeded. Grey Worm brought the case to Daenerys with the comprehensive documentation that was his professional standard. The evidence was complete. The conclusion was not in question. Daenerys looked at the file for a long time. Then she called Aemon in. He read the file. He asked 3 questions about the evidentiary chain. The answers satisfied him. He has a child, Dany said. Yes. A sick one. Yes, she was quiet. He knew what she was doing, the same calculation she made every time the cost of justice had a human face. The face didn't make the crime smaller, it made the punishment harder to hold cleanly. The precedent matters, he said gently. If household betrayals go unpunished because the circumstances were sympathetic, we create an incentive structure we can't sustain. I know, the child can be provided for. There's no reason his situation needs to be compounded. I know that too, she looked at him. You understand what I'm deciding? Yes, and he held her gaze. I think you're deciding correctly. I think it's right and I think it's hard and I think both of those things can be true. She ordered the execution. Grey Worm carried it out with his characteristic efficiency and minimum of theater. Daenerys went to attend the tribunal of another case, a grain dispute, mundane and necessary, and did not permit herself any visible space for the weight of what had just been decided. Eamon attended the execution because he felt that if a decision was made, it should be witnessed, that looking away from consequences was a form of dishonesty he had decided early not to practice. Afterward, he went to find the guard's child and arrange for the household fund provision he had promised. The child was 4 years old and running a fever and did not understand what had happened. Eamon sat with him for an hour while the child slept, not because it helped anything, but because it seemed like the least available form of acknowledgement. Then he went back to fleet logistics, because the fleet would not load itself and Westeros was waiting, and there was always more work than time to do it in. It was on the night 3 days before sailing that Tyrion came to him, not in the way of their usual working sessions, not with papers under his arm and a problem to solve. He came to Eamon's room after the household had gone quiet, and he sat in the chair across from Eamon's desk without being invited, and he looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has finally decided to put it down. Eamon waited. You've been building toward a question for the better part of a year, Tyrion said. I've watched you build it. You're careful about it, you approach it from different angles and then you stop before you arrive, and you go away and come back differently positioned. Eamon said nothing. I'm going to tell you something, Tyrion said, and I want you to understand that I'm telling you because we're about to sail for Westeros, where certain truths will either emerge or be weaponized by someone with less care than I'll take, and I would rather you have this from me than from a stranger with an agenda. Tell me, Eamon said. His voice was entirely steady. Tyrion looked at him. Your father was Rhaegar Targaryen, he said. Your mother was Lyanna Stark. You were born at the Tower of Joy in Dorne, where Rhaegar had kept her with her consent, contrary to the story Robert Baratheon told the realm. Ned Stark was your mother's brother. He found you there and took you and gave you to Daenerys, gave you to his queen's remaining family, because he could not protect you in the north without Robert discovering that the heir he thought he'd extinguished was alive. Silence. Daenerys does not know. Tyrion said, she was not told by Ned Stark. She believes you are Targaryen. She has inferred this from the dragons, but she believes your parentage is something more distant, a cousin's line, a collateral branch. She does not know you are Rhaegar's son. Eamon was looking at his hands on the desk. Which makes you, Tyrion continued, and there was something careful and very deliberate in his voice. By the succession laws of Westeros, by the laws that Daenerys herself would cite as the foundation of her claim, the true-born heir to the Iron Throne. The harbor was visible through the window. The ships were there, loaded and waiting, carrying an army across the world toward a home Eamon had never seen. You knew this, Eamon said. In Meereen, you knew it when you arrived. I suspected, I've confirmed since. Why tell me now? Because we're sailing in 3 days, and because there are Westerosi lords who know some version of this story, and because I would rather you walked into that country with your eyes open than had someone hand you this information in public as a weapon. Eamon sat with it. The thing he had been not pulling for 3 years, the thread he had been careful not to follow to its end. It was exactly what he had suspected it was. It was worse than he had suspected it was, in the specific way that confirmed suspicions are always worse than unconfirmed ones, because confirmation removes the last buffer of uncertainty. He was not her son. No, he was her nephew. Which was a biological relationship and a dynastic fact, and it changed nothing about the 23 years they had been to each other, and it changed everything about the world they were sailing into. She has to know, he said. Yes, Tyrion agreed. I have to tell her. I would strongly recommend it before someone else does. Not before we sail. He looked up at Tyrion. If I tell her now, it destabilizes the entire operation at the moment of maximum fragility. The fleet, the army, the alliances we've spent 2 years building, all of that depends on the stability of her authority in these next weeks. Tyrion considered this. When we're on the water, when there's nothing to do but sail and think and talk, he paused. She needs time she doesn't have on land. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. Then, you're protecting her, I'm managing the timing. Those are the same thing. He studied Eamon for a long moment. What do you want? Not what she needs, not what the logistics require. What do you want from this? Eamon thought about it seriously. He looked out at the harbor. I want her to have what she's working toward, he said. I want the realm to have someone ruling it who actually thinks about the realm, and he stopped. What? I want to still be her son when this is over, he said. I know what I am biologically, I know what the succession says, I know every political implication. He met Tyrion's eyes. She is my mother, that is the truest thing I know, and I will not let what I was born to unmake what I was raised to be. Tyrion looked at him for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. For what it's worth, he said, Rhaegar Targaryen was, by most accounts, a man who thought about the realm. He stood, gathering himself. And Lyanna Stark was a woman who chose her own path regardless of what anyone told her to be. He moved toward the door. You've inherited something from both of them beyond a claim to a chair, he left. Eamon sat alone with the harbor light and the 3 days until sailing, and thought about a man he had never met and a woman who had died so that he could live, and a woman upstairs who had raised him and did not yet know the full truth of what she had raised. He sat for a very long time. Then he opened the logistics ledger, because in 3 days a fleet would sail and someone had to make sure the numbers were right, and grief, the specific grief of a truth finally fully known, did not excuse a man from the work that was his. He made the numbers right. He closed the ledger. He went to sleep. In the morning, the sky was the color of a blade, and the ships were waiting, and Westeros was west. The sea was gray and enormous and did not care about any of them. Eamon stood at the prow of the lead ship on the 3rd morning out of Meereen and watched the water and thought about scale. He had spent his life in cities, the contained, navigable geography of streets and walls and rooms, and the open water was a different kind of world entirely, one that had no regard for the human need to feel located within something. The horizon was the same in every direction. The sky was the same. The ship moved and the sea moved and nothing changed except the quality of light. He found he didn't mind it. He found, actually, that he liked it, the enforced simplicity of it, the way it stripped the day down to its essentials. On land there was always something requiring response, some problem presenting itself, some small fire in need of dampening. On the water there was only the water and the work that could be done, and the conversations that the ordinary pace of life kept getting interrupted. He had been waiting to have one of those conversations for 3 days. Daenerys came to find him on the 4th evening. She had been occupied with council work since sailing. The fleet's first days were logistically complex, the 47 ships requiring coordination that produced a constant stream of decisions requiring her authority or Tyrion's. And their usual evening conversations had been shortened or cancelled by the demands of the operation. He had not pushed. He had waited and done his share of the coordination work, and watched the sun go down over gray water, and carried the weight of what Tyrion had told him with the careful steadiness of someone who has decided to carry a thing and is not going to drop it. She came to him at dusk, when the water had gone from gray to the particular purple-black of deep ocean at the end of light, and stood beside him at the stern rail and was quiet for a while in the way they were quiet together. The comfortable silence of people who do not need to fill space with words. You're thinking about something you haven't said yet, she said. Yes, you've been thinking about it since we sailed. Before that, he looked at the water. I need to tell you something. I've been finding the right time. There isn't a right time, but there's a better time than others, and this is it. She turned to look at him. The wind off the water had pulled her silver hair loose from its careful arrangement, and she had not bothered to fix it, which was always a sign that she was more herself than official. She looked younger when she didn't fix her hair. She looked like what she actually was beneath the queen, a woman who had survived an extraordinary amount and was tired in ways she would never admit. Tell me, she said. He told her, not all at once. Not the sudden blurted confession that would have prioritized his own need to have it done over her need to receive it with any dignity. He told her the way he had prepared to tell her, with the same careful sequencing he brought to everything, The foundation first, then the structure, then the thing the structure supported. He told her what Tyrion had said. Then he told her what he had suspected before Tyrion said it. Then he told her how long he had suspected it, and when the suspicion had become something closer to certainty and why he had waited. She did not speak. She stood at the rail and listened with her hands flat on the wood and her eyes on the water, and her face was the face she wore when she was receiving information that required her full processing capacity, still and attentive, giving nothing away while she worked through it. When he was finished, they were both quiet for a long time. The ship moved beneath them. The water was very dark. Rhaegar's son, she said, not a question. Yes, Lyanna Stark's. Yes, another silence, longer. He waited, watching her face, watching for the thing that would happen when the full weight of it arrived. Not the intellectual comprehension which she'd had within the first 30 seconds, but the emotional comprehension, the moment where it stopped being information and became real. It arrived quietly. He saw it in the slight change in her breathing, the way her hands pressed harder against the rail. I raised you, she said. Yes, from 6 weeks. Yes, you are mine. She said it with the particular fierceness of someone who has been told something that contradicts a fact they consider non-negotiable. Whatever this information says about succession or dynasty or blood, you are mine. I know, he said. I have always known that. Then why does this? She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. Why does it feel like a challenge to that? Because it is, he said, quietly and completely honestly, not to the reality of what we are to each other, but to what that means for everything we've sailed toward. He turned to face her fully. You know what the succession laws say? I know exactly what they say. Her voice was very controlled now. Rhaegar's legitimate son would supersede my claim. Yes, which means she stopped again. This stop was different from the previous ones, not gathering herself, but encountering something she had not yet looked at directly. She looked at it now. He watched her look at it and loved her for looking at it cleanly instead of away. Which means that by the same laws I've spent my life citing as the foundation of my right to the throne, she said, you have a stronger one. Yes, the silence this time was immense. The water moved. The ship moved. 3 dragons flew somewhere above the cloud line, occasionally visible as dark shapes against the dark sky, great, slow, impossible shapes that belonged to both of them in different measures. I'm not going to step aside, she said. The iron was there, the thing that lived in her under everything else. I want you to know that. I'm not telling you this as a threat. I'm telling you because we don't lie to each other and you should know what's true. She met his eyes. I have spent my whole life working toward this. I have given everything to it. I have lost so much, and I will not stand aside from the throne for anyone. I know, he said, even you, I know that too. He held her gaze steadily. I'm not asking you to. Her expression shifted. What are you asking? Nothing, he said. I'm not asking for anything. I told you because you needed to know and because someone else would have told you in a worse way at a worse time if I hadn't. Not because I want the throne. You don't want it, no, how can you not? She stopped, looked at him. Really looked at him the way she had when he was small, and she was trying to understand what he needed beneath what he was saying. You genuinely don't. I've never wanted it, he said. Not because I've told myself not to want it or because I'm practicing restraint. Because it has never been the thing I wanted. He paused, finding the words for something he had not had to articulate before. What I want is for the realm to be governed well, for people to be less hurt by the arbitrary facts of their birth and their circumstances. I want the war to end, and I want the Night King to be defeated, and I want Mirian to still be standing in 20 years. I want you to rule because you are the best answer to what Westeros needs. He paused. Not because you're my mother, because you're actually the best answer. She was quiet for a long time. The wind came off the water. You might be the only person who has ever said that to me, she said, who I believed. He looked at her. She was 28 years old and had been told since childhood that she was destined for the throne, which was a different thing entirely from being told she deserved it on her merits. And those were different from the thing Eamon was saying, which was that she was the right person for the work independent of destiny or blood or the accidents of who her father had been. I believe it, he said. Completely. Another long silence. Then she put her hand over his on the rail, briefly, the way she had when he was small and the world was being too large. She held it there for a moment and then released it. It changes nothing, she said. Between us? No, but it changes things. Yes, he agreed. We'll have to decide how many people know and when and what the political framing is. Tyrion already knows, varies. Almost certainly, she exhaled. Anyone else? He thought about Bran, the three-eyed raven, who was a rumor and a mystery in Marion's intelligence reports, who supposedly knew things that had no reasonable source. He thought about Ned Stark. He chose not to introduce those complications yet, one conversation at a time, not that I know of. He said. She nodded. Her expression had the quality of someone who has received a blow and is evaluating the damage with professional calm before deciding how to respond. All right, she said. All right, we keep it contained for now. When we land at Dragonstone, I'll have Tyrion present me with a legal analysis of the succession question and its strategic implications. There's a Westerosi legal argument that legitimacy requires a septons ceremony, which Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark had in secret without witnesses who are still living. The legitimacy question is genuinely disputable. She looked at him sharply. You've already worked through the legal angles. I had 4 days, and I think better when I'm working through a problem than when I'm sitting with it. Something that was not quite a smile but was in the vicinity of one crossed her face. Of course you have. She straightened, releasing the rail, reassembling herself into the shape of a queen, not falsely, but the way anyone assembles themselves when the private moment is over and the world is waiting. We sail for Dragonstone. We plan the campaign. We deal with Westeros before we deal with each other's complicated bloodlines. Yes, and Aemon, she paused, his name in her voice, the specific way she said it when she was saying something she needed him to hear. What I said about it changing nothing. Yes, I meant it. You are my son. The fierceness again, the non-negotiable quality. Not metaphorically, not as a political convenience. You are my son, and I will not let anyone use this information to suggest otherwise. He looked at her in the failing light, this woman who had raised him and fed him and fought with him and taught him half of everything he knew. Who had been terrified and triumphant and lonely and magnificent in his presence across 15 years of a life that was not the one either of them would have chosen, but that was the one they had, and that they had made into something neither of them could have predicted. I know, he said. I know. Dragonstone rose from the sea like a fist. Aemon had read descriptions of it, had read every account available in Illyrio's library and Tyrion's considerable personal collection, and still the reality of it exceeded the words. It was built of ancient volcanic stone that had been shaped by Valyrian sorcery into the forms of dragons, not decoratively but structurally, the architecture itself expressing its builder's nature. The towers were dragons, the walls were dragons. The whole fortress was a statement of what the people who built it believed about themselves and their place in the world. He stood on the deck, as they approached, and felt something he had not expected. He felt something like recognition. Not memory, he had not been here, or had been here only as an infant in the hold of a ship sailing away from it, which was not the same as being here, but something adjacent to memory. The shape of the place in the early morning light, the way the stone caught the gray Atlantic sky, the smell of the salt wind against volcanic rock. It pressed against something inside him with the insistence of a word he couldn't quite recall. Daenerys stood beside him and said nothing for a long time. I was born here, she said finally. I know, I've never seen it. He looked at her. She was looking at the fortress with an expression he recognized from a different context, the expression she wore when something she had believed abstractly for years became suddenly and entirely real. The grief and the triumph so close together they were almost a single thing. He did not say anything. Some moments required nothing from the person standing beside you except their presence. Dragonstone was cold and damp and magnificent, and full of problems. The first delegation arrived within 2 days of landing. Jon Snow and his people from the north, which in this timeline was Sansa Stark as Lady of Winterfell. Jon Snow being the name they had given to the child sent east, not yet knowing it was also the name of the man who had returned as Aemon. The confusion would resolve itself awkwardly, it always did, but that was in the future. The first problem was the one Tyrion placed in front of Daenerys the morning after landing. The Greyjoy Fleet Alliance, which was valuable and complicated by Euron Greyjoy's parallel offer to Cersei, and the timeline for moving against the Lannister supply lines. And the question of whether to strike south immediately or consolidate northern support first. Aemon took the eastern wing of the castle as his working space, a series of rooms that looked out over the sea, and began the work of translating their army of 40,003 dragons from a fleet to a land force. Logistics, always logistics. Supply lines and grain stores and the positions of Lannister garrisons, and the intelligence reports that Varys had spent 2 decades cultivating, and was now laying out with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose investment has finally matured. He also began reading the reports on Westeros's great houses with the hunger of a student who has been studying a subject from secondary sources his whole life, and has just been given access to the primary documents. The Reach was the breadbasket of the realm and had recently pledged to Cersei, which was a logistics problem. The Stormlands were fractured. The Vale was cautious. The Riverlands were exhausted by decades of conflict and would align with whoever they believed would actually win, a pragmatic position that Aemon respected more than he perhaps should have. The North was the North, which meant complicated and essential and not to be taken for granted. He was working through the Northern Intelligence report on an evening 3 weeks into their Dragonstone stay when Tyrion appeared in the doorway. "There's been a development with the Northern Envoy," Tyrion said. "Which one?" There had been several Northern envoys, various lords sending careful messages of support or careful messages of neutrality depending on their calculation of the odds. The one that matters. Tyrion's expression was doing something complicated. "Sansa Stark is here. She arrived an hour ago." Aemon set down the report. "Dany knows. She's receiving her now. That's not the development." Tyrion came fully into the room and closed the door behind him. Eddard Stark came with her. Aemon went very still. "He's alive," Tyrion said. Exiled to Winterfell after Robert's rebellion, there was a negotiated settlement in this version of events that your mother's sources apparently missed or understated. "He's been at Winterfell for 15 years, and he's here." "He knows who I am," Aemon said, "not a question." "He's the one who gave you to Daenerys." Tyrion's voice was level and careful. "Yes, he knows who you are. He's known since before you were born." Aemon looked at the intelligence report in front of him, the careful columns of northern houses and their troop strengths and their historical allegiances, and thought about the man who had walked down a dark Dornish beach and placed an infant in a young girl's arms and walked away without looking back. "Where is he?" he asked. "The Great Hall. With Sansa, they'll finish with Daenerys within the hour. I want to speak with him alone." He said it clearly, without hesitation. "Not in a council, not in a formal setting. Before anything else is decided or planned or politically arranged, I want to speak with him." Tyrion studied him. "Are you sure? Are you asking whether I'm emotionally prepared for it?" "I'm asking whether the timing is right given everything else that's happening." Aemon looked at him steadily. "There will never be a right time. There's only this time." He stood. "I'll go to the small hall near the east wing. Tell him his sister's son would like to speak with him." "Use exactly those words." Tyrion's expression was unreadable for a moment, then he nodded and went. Ned Stark was older than Aemon had imagined. He had constructed an image from the descriptions available. Barristan had known him slightly, Jorah had known him by reputation. Tyrion had known him from King's Landing, and the image had coalesced into something. A large, serious northern lord built like a castle, wearing honor like armor. The man who came into the small hall was all of that, but he was also gray at the temples and moving with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints had been reminding him of his age, and he had eyes that were the exact gray of a northern winter sky and were, at the moment, focused on Aemon with an intensity that stopped just short of undoing them both. Aemon waited. Ned Stark stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he came in and sat down across the small table without being invited and placed his hands flat on the wood and looked at Aemon. "You have your mother's eyes," he said. His voice was a northern voice, slower than southern voices, more deliberate, as though each word were being weighed before release. Aemon said nothing. He had planned to have something to say, had worked through several versions of an opening in the week since Tyrion had told him about this meeting, but looking at the man's face, at the grief in it that was structural in exactly the way Tyrion had described. Grief that had been there long enough to become part of the architecture, none of the planned versions seemed adequate. "Gray," Ned continued. "She had gray eyes, northern eyes." He paused. "And your father's everything else, the build, the dark hair, the—" He stopped, started again differently. "You look like a Stark and a Targaryen at once, and somehow neither of them separately." I've been told I look like Dany, Eamon said. Something moved across Ned Stark's face. You do that too, he exhaled slowly. I have rehearsed this conversation for 16 years. I have had it in my head 100 different ways, with 100 different versions of who you might have become. None of them, he looked at Eamon with the gray eyes, none of them were quite right. I don't know how to do this either, Eamon said. I want you to know that. If it makes it easier. It doesn't, Ned said, not unkindly. Nothing makes it easier, that's not a complaint, it's just true. A pause. The sea wind moved through the castle's stone corridors, distant and constant. Tell me about her, Eamon said. Ned looked at him. My mother, Eamon said. Lyanna, I want to know about her. He paused. Not the political version, not the story that explains what happened, just who she was. Ned Stark looked at him for a long moment with those structural grief eyes, and then he told him. He talked for a long time. He talked about a girl who had been fiercer than anyone expected a girl to be, who had ridden better than her brothers and fought them tooth and nail for the right to be taken seriously, who had a laugh that was unexpected, he said, a bigger laugh than her size suggested. The kind that took the whole room by surprise. He talked about her stubbornness, which was the particular Stark stubbornness of people who have decided what they believe and will not be argued out of it by convenience. He talked about the way she had looked at their father, and at Jon Arryn when they had arranged her betrothal to Robert Baratheon, not rebellion exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a resistance forming behind her eyes. He talked about the end of it in a way that was briefer and harder, the Tower of Joy, the promise she had made him make with her dying breath, which was that he would keep her son alive and safe regardless of the cost to himself. I kept it, he said. For 16 years I kept it alone. My wife never knew, she thought you were mine, my bastard, and that cost us something. He said it plainly, without self-pity. I chose to pay that cost, I would choose it again. The promise was the right promise to keep. Until you gave me to Daenerys, Eamon said. Until I gave you to your aunt, Ned corrected. Then, quietly, to your mother, however the word is rightly applied. Eamon looked at the table. She raised me, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever she is to me biologically, she raised me. She is my mother in the way that matters. I know. Ned's voice was quiet. Barristan's reports reached me eventually through Varys' channels. I knew you were with her. I knew she was, he paused. I knew she was raising you well. You've been receiving reports. For years. Eamon absorbed this. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the part that processed information separately from emotion, a thought formed. This man has been watching from a distance for 15 years and chose not to come forward, and that choice has its own complexity that deserves examination later when there is time. Why now, he asked. Why come here now? Because the dead are marching, Ned Stark said, with the simple directness of a man who has decided to stop circling. Because whatever I chose 15 years ago for political reasons, because I told myself it was better for you to be far from Robert's reach, the world has changed and the reasons have changed. And because Sansa told me what was coming across the wall and I decided that whatever I owe to my own cowardice, I owe more to my sister's son. The wind moved through the corridors. The dead, Eamon said. Bran saw them, Ned said. Bran sees many things. The army of the dead is real and it's moving south and the wall will not hold indefinitely. He met Eamon's eyes. You'll need to deal with that before you deal with Cersei, in my estimation, for what my estimation is worth. Eamon thought about Meereen, about supply chains and priorities and the cost of being right too late. It's worth something, he said. They were quiet for a moment. You should meet your cousins, Ned said. The tone shifted slightly, not warmer exactly, but more human, the tone of a man who has delivered his necessary truths and is now doing the harder work of trying to build something in their aftermath. She's remarkable. She's been through things that would have broken most people, and she's managed not to be broken, though it's changed the shape of her considerably. Arya, a brief expression crossed his face that was the most unguarded thing Eamon had seen from him. Arya is the one who reminds me most of Lyanna. She'll probably try to fight you within 5 minutes of meeting you. I'll look forward to it, Eamon said, and meant it. Ned Stark looked at him, really looked at him, with the gray eyes that were Lyanna's eyes that were Eamon's eyes, and something in his face shifted into something that was not quite resolution but was adjacent to it. The movement of a man who has been carrying guilt for 16 years and has just been shown, however provisionally, that the thing he did to protect someone actually protected them. She would have loved you, he said. Your mother, she would have, he stopped. The structural grief moved through him visibly, like weather. "I'm sorry I couldn't keep you myself." Eamon was quiet for a moment. "You kept me the way you could," he said. "You made a good choice with limited options, I understand that." He paused. "I spent 3 years in Meereen making governance decisions under resource constraints. I understand the arithmetic of imperfect choices." Ned Stark looked at him and laughed, a short, surprised sound, genuine and slightly helpless. "You are very like her," he said, "the practicality." She was practical the same way, right through whatever was happening, emotionally practical. "Is that a Stark trait?" "It's a survival trait," Ned said. "The Starks just practice it more than most." The Field of Fire came 6 weeks later. They had named it for the original, because naming a second catastrophe after the first was either hubris or honesty, and either way it was accurate. The Lannister supply train was enormous. 40 wagons, 2,000 infantry, a gold shipment moving from Highgarden to King's Landing, and it was moving through an open field in the Reach with the confidence of an army that had not yet genuinely believed the dragons were real. The dragons were real. Aemon flew regal in his first major battle engagement on the left flank, coordinating with Grey Worms unsullied on the ground below. He had practiced aerial coordination with the ground commanders for 3 weeks before the engagement, working out signal systems, establishing the specific conditions under which Regal's fire would be used and under which it would not, making the tactical calculation that undirected dragonfire on a battlefield is a weapon against your own discipline as much as the enemy's formations. He was not reckless. He was not Dario, who would have made it beautiful. He was surgical, striking the supply wagons, the gold, the grain, the material, and the heavy infantry formations that threatened Grey Worm's flanks, and leaving the routed soldiers to scatter, because a routed man who is allowed to run is a better outcome than a routed man who is burned and becomes propaganda. Daenerys on Drogon was something different. She was magnificent, and she was terrible, and she was everything that the word conqueror meant when it meant its best thing: unstoppable and righteous, and absolutely sure. Aemon watched her from Regal's back and felt the familiar, complicated love, the thing that contained pride and concern and the specific worry of someone who knows a person's greatest strength is also the place they are most vulnerable. It was over in 2 hours. On the ground afterward, he walked through the wreckage of the supply lines with Grey Worm, doing the grim accounting: what had been destroyed, what could be salvaged, how many Lannister dead, and how many had scattered. Whether pursuit was tactically sound or likely to extend beyond recoverable supply range. Work, the always work of the aftermath. A Lannister soldier, young, his armor identifying him as Tarly household infantry, not even Lannister proper, had taken an arrow and was propped against a burned wagon trying to keep pressure on his side. Aemon crouched beside him and looked at the wound and called for the field surgeon and held the man's hand while they waited, because there was nothing else immediately useful to do. The soldier was perhaps 16 years old. He looked at Aemon with the wide eyes of someone who is in pain and afraid and trying not to show either. "Is it bad?" he asked. Aemon looked at the wound. "It was not good. The surgeon will be here in a moment," he said. "Keep the pressure." I signed with Lord Tarly 6 months ago." The boy said. The talking was helping him, which was probably why he was doing it. "I thought it would be. I didn't know about the dragons." "No one ever really knows about the dragons," Aemon said. "Not until they see them." The surgeon arrived. Aemon left. He did not know if the boy survived, and added him to the long list of things he carried from that day. Daenerys found him that evening on the battlements of a captured Reach fortress, doing what he always did when he needed to think, looking at the horizon. She was flushed from the battle still, not physically, not anymore, but the particular inner brightness of someone who has done a thing their whole nature was built for and has done it well. He recognized it. He had seen it in her before, in the moments after a stapper in Meereen, when the waiting resolved into action and the action resolved into outcome. He also saw the thing beneath it. She always thought he didn't see the thing beneath it. 1,100 dead, he said. He wasn't making an accusation. He was saying what was true. Soldiers who chose to serve Cersei, she said. The iron quick to arrive, some of them. Some were farmers 6 months ago. She was quiet. "I'm not saying it was wrong," he said. The supply lines needed to go and the tactical conditions were correct, and the engagement was executed well. He turned to look at her. I'm saying 1,100 people died today, and that's the kind of thing that should be said plainly, not to make us feel worse. To make sure we don't stop feeling it at all. She looked at him for a long moment, the brightness and the thing beneath it in balance. You always do that, she said. What? Say the true hard thing so that I don't have to pretend it isn't there. Someone should. I used to do it for myself. She said, quietly, not accusing, not quite. Before, I used to say the hard things to myself in private and hold them and know them. You still do, with more help now. He held her gaze. Is that a complaint? She was quiet for a moment. Then, no. She looked out at the darkening reach, the green hills and the burned field in the distance that was still full of Westeros to cross. No, it's not a complaint. They stood together in the evening the way they always had, with the world spread out around them and its demands temporarily suspended, and neither of them needed to say anything else, so they didn't. Below them, the camp settled into its nighttime rhythms. Above them, the dragons circled, vast and slow, dark shapes against a darkening sky. The war was barely begun. The real war, the one beyond the wall, hadn't started. But for now there was this. A mother and son on a battlement in the Reach, alive and together and telling each other the truth, which is not a small thing. It is, in fact, everything. The North received them like a held breath. Aemon rode into the neck at the head of a column of 300, unsullied and Dothraki outriders and a small council staff, lean and fast. The kind of force that says we come to talk without saying we come unarmed. Daenerys had remained at Dragonstone managing the southern campaign, which was the correct tactical decision, and which she had made with the composed certainty of a woman who has learned to separate what she wants from what the situation requires. She had wanted to come north herself. She had sent Aemon instead. You speak to people differently than I do, she had said the night before he rode out, not a criticism, an accurate assessment. I have less to prove to them, he said. That's not what I mean. She had been looking at the campaign map, her finger tracing the northern roads without quite touching the parchment. I mean that when I speak, people hear the dragons first and me second. When you speak, they hear you. She paused. The North needs to hear a person right now, not a conqueror. He had not said, because I am from here in ways you are not. He had not said it because it would have been unkind, and because it was only partly true. He had never been in the North, had never seen its gray hills and its pine forests and its enormous sky, but the blood in him knew this place, or knew something adjacent to knowing it. The way you sometimes recognize a face you cannot place. The North did not welcome them, it watched them, which was a different thing. Winterfell in winter was exactly what the northern histories said it was, and nothing that language could adequately prepare you for. It was not a castle in the southern sense. It was a settlement, a small city unto itself, built over generations by people who understood that the cold was not an inconvenience, but a fundamental fact that everything else had to be arranged around. It was warm inside, geothermally heated by the hot springs that ran beneath it, which produced the particular uncanny comfort of a place that is alive with heat while the world around it is dying of cold. Sansa Stark received him in the Great Hall. She was 22 years old, and had the bearing of someone who had learned to hold herself as though the world were always watching, because for most of her life it had been. She was beautiful in the precise, careful way of people who have discovered that beauty is a tool and have decided to use it deliberately rather than incidentally. Her eyes were tully blue and very steady and gave absolutely nothing away. She stood when he entered and said, Lord Aemon. Winterfell welcomes the representative of Queen Daenerys Targaryen. The phrasing was technically impeccable and completely neutral, which was itself a statement. Lady Sansa, he said, thank you for receiving us. I'll try not to make this harder than it needs to be. She looked at him for a moment, a brief, assessing look that she immediately composed back into courtesy. Something in the look said, I did not expect that opening. Something else in it said, I am reserving judgment. Sit, she said. We'll eat, and you can tell me what you've actually come to discuss. The dinner was northern food, which was abundant and heavy and exactly right for the cold, and the conversation over it was careful in the way of people who are being careful. Sansa was testing him, not rudely, not even visibly to most observers, but he could feel the testing, the series of small propositions she was advancing to see how he responded. Questions about the southern campaign that were also questions about Daenerys' methods. Questions about the Unsullied that were also questions about whether the Queen's army was the kind that paid for what it took from villages. Questions about his role that were really questions about what kind of person he was. He answered all of them directly and completely, including the ones she hadn't technically asked. By the end of the meal, she was looking at him differently. The hostility had not gone. He understood that Sansa Stark's hostility was not something that dissolved over dinner, that it had been built across years of catastrophic experience with people who had seemed trustworthy, but it had developed a texture. It was no longer uniform. "You're not what I expected," she said when the plates had been cleared and the servants had been dismissed. "What did you expect? A dragon prince?" She said it without particular inflection. Someone who has been told they're special so many times it's become the main fact of them. "I've been told I'm useful," he said. "That's different." A pause. "Yes," she said, "it is." Arya found him the next morning. He had gone out early before the household was fully awake to walk the outer walls because he needed to see the land and the walls and the shape of Winterfell's defenses from the outside before any official tour made it a performance rather than an assessment. He had been walking the eastern wall for perhaps 20 minutes when he became aware that he was being followed. He stopped. Silence. "You're good," he said to the air in front of him. More silence. Then from above, "You heard me." He looked up. A young woman, not girl exactly, the word was wrong for whatever she was sitting on the wall above him with the comfortable unconcern of someone who has been in high places since childhood. She dropped down beside him with the kind of landing that is either trained or reckless or, in the rarest cases, both. "Eamon," she said, not a greeting, more like a test of the word. "Arya," he said. She looked at him with eyes that were. He understood immediately what Ned Stark had meant, back in Dragonstone, when he'd said she reminded him most of Lyanna. There was something in the directness of her gaze that was not politeness and not hostility, but simply an absolute refusal to pretend to see anything other than what was there. "You look like us," she said. "People keep saying that. Because it's true." She tilted her head. "You have the Stark look, the dark hair, the shape of the face, under the Valyrian bits." She was studying him with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. "Father said you would. He mentioned me." Eamon was careful to keep his voice level. "He's mentioned you my whole life." Arya said, "Not by name, but we knew there was something he was carrying that he couldn't put down. Sansa thought it was guilt about your mother." She paused. "Our mother, Lady Catelyn." "Was it?" "Partly," she shrugged, an economical movement. "Father carries a lot of things. He's better at it than most people, but it takes a toll." She looked at him sideways. "He told us who you were 2 days before we came here. Sansa took it in and immediately started calculating. I had more feelings about it." "What kind of feelings?" She was quiet for a moment, looking out over the wall at the gray northern landscape, the pine forests and the snow and the enormous empty sky. "I've always wanted more siblings," she said. "The ones I have are fine mostly, but I always wanted someone different." She glanced at him again. "I'm not saying you're that. I'm saying I have feelings and they're complicated, and I'm telling you because I think honesty is more efficient than performing emotions I don't have." He looked at her. "I think that too," he said. "Honesty being more efficient." She looked back at him. Something in her expression shifted very slightly into something less accessory and more actual. "Father said you were raised well," she said. "That's not nothing coming from him." "It means a great deal to me," Eamon said, and meant it. "Don't be." She stopped, started again differently. "Be careful with Sansa. She's not what she looks like. She's been hurt by people who are good at performing trust. She can read performance very well now. But genuine things she paused. She sometimes doesn't know what to do with because she's not used to them." "I'll be careful," he said. Arya looked at him for another long moment. Then, "Do you actually know how to fight, or is it just the dragon?" "Both," he said. Her expression did what it had done, the shift towards something realer. "We'll go to the yard after breakfast," she said, not an invitation. A statement of what was going to happen. "I want to see." "All right," he said. She turned and walked back toward the inner keep with the slightly uncanny movement of someone who has rebuilt their relationship with their own body into something more than most people's. He watched her go and thought. Lyanna was fierce, Ned had said. She had a bigger laugh than her size suggested. He thought, "I understand that now." Bran was in the Godswood. He had been told this before he went to find him, that Bran Stark was often in the Godswood, that he had a relationship with it that was not exactly explicable in ordinary terms. He had also been told that Bran was the Three-Eyed Raven, which was a title that the intelligence reports had never adequately clarified, offering descriptions that ranged from seer to greenseer to something older than either word. none of which gave Eamon a practical framework for what to expect. What he found in the godswood was a young man of 18 sitting in a wheelchair before the heart tree, with white filmed eyes that were looking at something that was not in the godswood, or perhaps looking at everything in the godswood simultaneously. Or perhaps looking at things that had no location in the present at all. The great white-barked tree loomed above him, its carved face wearing the expression, half sorrowful, half knowing, that heart trees always wore, as though they had been waiting long enough to understand that waiting was the primary nature of things. Eamon stood at the edge of the godswood and waited. After a moment, Bran's eyes cleared. Not gradually, abruptly, a shift from absence to presence that had nothing dreamlike about it. He looked at Eamon, and the look was unlike any Eamon had received before, not assessing, not testing, not trying to determine what he was. It was the look of someone who already knows the answer to every question they might ask and is simply regarding the reality of a thing they've already seen. Eamon, Bran said. Brandon Stark, Eamon said. Bran, he said it quietly, a correction that was not unfriendly. I was Brandon, I'm Bran now. A pause that seemed to contain something Eamon couldn't identify. Come here. Eamon crossed the godswood and sat on the stone bench beside the wheelchair. Up close, Bran's eyes were extraordinary, not the white-filmed absence of the seer state, but something more active, a quality of attention that seemed to move through time the way other people's attention moved through space. You have your mother's eyes, Bran said. Eamon blinked. Everyone says that, I know. Something in Bran's expression was the ghost of amusement, deeply buried. I know everything that has been said to you and much that will be. A pause. I'm telling you because it's true and because she was worth seeing clearly. Your mother, did you see her? Eamon asked. In your whatever you do. I was at the Tower of Joy, Bran said. The past tense was wrong and right simultaneously. I watched my father find her. I watched what she said to him at the end. He was quiet for a moment. She was brave. Not in the performed way, not the way that needs witnesses. The quiet kind, the kind that holds on because it has decided that what it's holding on for is worth the cost. Eamon looked at the heart tree. She held on long enough to make him promise, Bran continued, and the promise was you. Your existence was the thing she decided was worth the cost of everything else. He paused. I thought you should know that, in case no one has told you plainly. No one had told him plainly. He sat with it for a moment. The godswood was very still. The heart tree looked down at him with its knowing grief. You know everything, Eamon said, about what I am, what the succession question means. Yes, what happens if you've seen it? He hesitated. If you can say. Bran looked at him. I see many threads, he said, not one future. The threads change based on choices, and most of the choices are still ahead of you. He paused. But I can tell you what I see most consistently across the threads I've walked. Tell me. I see you standing between her and a decision she cannot unmake, Bran said. I see that moment in many versions, and in most of them you are the thing that changes the outcome. He was quiet. I don't see you on the Iron Throne. Good, Eamon said. You mean that, completely. Bran looked at him for a long moment. Most people who discover they have a claim to power spend considerable energy pretending not to want it while wanting it, he said. It's unusual to meet someone who actually doesn't. I've watched someone else want it my whole life, Eamon said. I know what it costs. I know what it does to a person, the wanting. I don't want that. He paused. I want the realm to survive. I want the dead to be stopped. I want Dany to be the queen she's capable of being without the thing inside her that the throne calls out going too far. He looked at Bran. That's enough to want. That's more than enough. Bran was quiet for a long time. Then, the dead are closer than your intelligence reports say, he said. The wall will hold through this winter and perhaps the next, but the Night King is not waiting. He is building. He turned his filmed gaze to something Eamon couldn't see. You'll need the dragons north of the wall before the end, both of them. Both. Dany will resist. She'll see it as a tactical overcommitment. He paused. She won't be wrong. It will be a tactical overcommitment. It will also be necessary. Eamon absorbed this. What else? Dragonglass, Bran said. There's a mountain of it beneath Dragonstone. Tyrion's already found the relevant information in the castle's records. He'll tell you within a fortnight. He's been sitting on it until the political moment seems right, which is a Tyrion thing to do. A pause. Tell him you already know. He'll respect that you found it yourself, and it will save 2 weeks of his positioning. Eamon almost smiled. Anything else? Ghost is coming, Bran said. Eamon went still. What? Your direwolf. Bran's expression was the closest thing to warm he had produced in the conversation. He's been in the Wolfswood for 3 days. He's been following your party since the neck. He'll come to you tonight or tomorrow when he decides the time is right, which is a direwolf thing to do." He paused. "He's been alive because he was made for you. Direwolves found south of the wall are an omen, and you are what the omen was for." Eamon looked at the heart tree. He had read about Ghost in the Northern Histories, the direwolf pup found by the Stark children, the one that had gone south with the household and disappeared in the chaos of Robert Baratheon's court. He had read about it with the distant interest he gave anything connected to his parentage, which was curious but armored, kept at the length of intellectual engagement rather than emotional reality. Now he thought about an animal that had been waiting for him for 17 years. The godswood held them in its silence. The heart tree looked down. "Thank you," Eamon said, "for telling me about my mother." "She asked me to," Bran said, not explaining, stating a fact. The timelines in which Bran existed were not the timelines other people inhabited. Eamon did not ask for clarification. He stood and bowed to Bran Stark with the genuine respect he gave to things that were genuinely worthy of it, and left the godswood. Ghost came that night. Eamon was in his chambers, a spare northern room with thick walls and a fire and the smell of pine resin that seemed to have soaked into the stone over centuries. Working through the dragonglass report that he had asked Tyrion to send north, the one Tyrion had ostensibly not yet prepared. The knock at his door came at the second hour past midnight, which was odd, and when he opened it there was no one there, just the wolf. Ghost was immense. Direwolves from the stories were large, but the stories had not prepared him for the reality of an animal that came to his shoulder and was white as fresh snow and had eyes the color of blood, not aggressively. Not the red of threat, but the red of something that has been burning for a long time and has not gone out. The wolf looked at him. He had read that you should not look a strange wolf in the eyes. He looked Ghost in the eyes. Ghost stepped forward and pressed his head against Eamon's chest with the force of a large animal that is not being careful about its weight. And Eamon brought both hands up and held the wolf's head and stood in his doorway in the dark castle, while something in his chest that had been braced for his entire life released. He could not have explained it. He did not try. He stood in the doorway holding the wolf's face in his hands, and Ghost breathed against him with the slow warmth of a living thing, and the fire in the room behind him threw their shadows long against the corridor stones. After a while he stepped back, and Ghost came into the room and lay beside the fire, and Eamon sat on the floor beside him and put his hand on the wolf's side and felt the breathing. And outside the thick northern walls, the wind came down from the mountains with the cold at its center that spoke of things waiting in the dark beyond all walls. He sat for a long time. He was thinking about his mother, who had held on long enough to make her brother promise. He was thinking about Ned Stark on a dark beach giving an infant to a young girl, a choice made in the arithmetic of imperfect options that had turned out against the odds to be right. He was thinking about Daenerys at a small breakfast table telling him, "You are mine, whatever else is true." He was thinking about Regal on a terrace in Meereen pressing its head into his small hand, and Ghost doing the same thing now with more weight but the same quality of recognition. He was thinking about what Bran had said, "You are what the omen was for." He had spent his life understanding himself as the person beside the person who mattered, Dany's support, her counsel, the practical intelligence behind the Conqueror's fire. And that was true, and he did not resent it, and it was not a small thing to be. But sitting on the floor of a northern room with a direwolf breathing beside him, and the convergence of two great houses in his blood, and the memory of a mother he had never met who had decided he was worth dying for. He understood for the first time with his whole self rather than just his mind that he was also something in his own right, not the throne, not the claim, not the dynasty, something else, something that didn't have a clean name yet. He sat with it until the fire burned low, and then he added wood and Ghost slept and the night passed. The council with the northern lords assembled 2 days after his arrival. Sansa had arranged it with the precise organizational intelligence that Eamon was beginning to understand was her primary weapon, the right lords in the right order, the seating that communicated hierarchy without explicitly stating it. The agenda that appeared open and was in fact carefully structured. He recognized the architecture because it was the same architecture he used in Meereen. He recognized in her, for the first time, a version of himself that had been built by different materials in a different fire. He said so privately before the council began. She looked at him. That's either a compliment or an accusation. Both, he said. Mostly a compliment. She studied him for a moment with those precise blue eyes. Then, you're better at this than I expected, she said. The honesty. Most people who say honest things use them as weapons. Some of mine are weapons, he said. I try to only use them on people who are actually threats. The ghost of something, not quite a smile, but in that direction, crossed her face. I'll be watching to see if that holds. Good, he said. I want you watching. She looked at him again, the assessing look, and this time what it found seemed to slightly revise what it was assessing. All right, she said. Let's go in. The Northern Lords were skeptical and cold, and had the particular territorial dignity of people who have been governing themselves in difficult circumstances for a long time and are not interested in being told that their governance has been insufficient. Lord Glover was hostile outright. Lord Manderley was cautious and watching. The smaller lords followed Sansa's lead with the deference of people who have decided that Sansa Stark's judgment is worth more than their own instincts, which Aemon found both admirable and interesting. He did not come at them the way Daenerys would have come at them. He did not cite the Dragon Queen's power or her dragons or the scale of her army, all of which were real and relevant, but which would have produced the precise defensiveness he needed to avoid. He came at them with the dead. The army of the dead is real, he said, when the formal pleasantries had run their course. I know some of you have received reports that say otherwise from sources in the South that have been telling you for years that the Night's Watch's concerns are the superstitions of men who have spent too long in the cold. Those sources are wrong. I have seen the evidence directly, he paused. My cousin Brandon Stark has seen the army itself. He is not a man given to exaggeration. The mention of Bran shifted the room. Not dramatically, Northern Lords did not shift dramatically, but the quality of the listening changed. He spent an hour on the dead. Evidence, tactics, the dragonglass situation, the timeline Bran had given him, the structural analysis of what the wall could and could not be expected to hold against. He spoke as someone who had spent years in governance rooms identifying problems and building coalitions to address them, and the Northern Lords, who were practical people with practical problems, recognized the approach. He was not performing authority. He was doing the work. Lord Manderley spoke first after the evidence presentation. You said your cousin, Brandon Stark, is your cousin. Yes, he had been prepared for this. Ned Stark had told him the Northern Lords knew that he had told them before the journey south, had told them plainly in the way Ned Stark told all things. My mother was Lyanna Stark. My father was Rhaegar Targaryen. I was raised by Queen Daenerys. I represent her interests here today, and I am also in blood of the North. Silence. The complicated northern silence of people deciding how they feel about a complicated thing. Lyanna Stark's son, Lord Glover said. His hostility had changed quality. It was still hostility, but it was now hostility engaged with something real rather than dismissing something foreign. Yes. Another silence. The Queen's forces, Sansa said, cutting through it with the precision of someone who has been reading the room and has identified the right moment. We've heard the threat. What is she offering and what does she need from the North in return? She's offering the dragons, Aemon said. When the time comes, when the wall fails or when the Night King moves against a fixed point. She is offering to bring fire from the south against the dead in the north. He paused. What she needs is for the North to stop treating this as a Targaryen war and start treating it as the war it actually is. The war at the end of everything. The war that loses or wins for all of us equally. The room was quiet, then Lord Manderley said, Lyanna Stark's boy. And it was in his voice, the shift, the northern thing that calculates loyalty in the currency of blood and place and the particular claims of the dead on the living. Come to ask us to fight. Come to tell you what's coming. Aemon said, whether you fight is your choice, I won't take it from you, but you should make it with full information. Manderley looked at him for a long time. He had the eyes of a large man who has lived long enough to be very careful about what he believes, and who, once having decided to believe something, does not change without cause. We'll fight, he said. And the other lords followed, one by one in the measured northern way, not enthusiasm, not theater, but the solid, irrevocable commitment of people who have decided and do not revisit decisions once made. Ned Stark found him afterward, in the Godswood where Aemon had gone to let the cold and the silence settle some of the day's accumulated weight. They sat together on the stone bench, which was cold enough to feel through the layers of northern clothing Sansa had provided, and were quiet in the way they had established in Dragonstone, a comfortable silence that was still building the architecture of itself, still learning what it could hold. "You did well in there," Ned said. "The Northern Lords are not difficult once you stop trying to impress them," Eamon said. "Most people keep trying to impress them. Most people think authority comes from being impressive." He looked at the heart tree. "It comes from being useful." "Impressive is a different thing." Ned was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about leadership considerably." "I've watched it for 15 years. Her, not a question, her," Eamon confirmed. "And Jorah, who taught me what steadiness looks like. And Barristan, who showed me what happens to a man's judgment when his loyalty overrides it. And Missandei, who is the most effective administrator I have ever met and gets no credit for it because she doesn't want credit, she wants outcomes." He paused. "I've had good examples. And some bad ones that taught differently." Ned Stark nodded slowly. "Then, I want to apologize," he said. "I've wanted to say it since Dragonstone. I wasn't sure of the form." "You don't need to, I do." Ned's voice was even, the flat northern evenness that was not coldness, but was its own kind of intensity. "I gave you away. I had reasons. The reasons were real. But you deserved better than reasons, and I want you to know that the choice cost me more than it may have seemed, and that if there was another way I couldn't find it." He paused. "I don't ask you to forgive it. I ask you to know it was not easy." Eamon looked at the heart tree. He thought about what it would have meant to be raised in the north, by this man, in this cold place, with Sansa's precision and Arya's fire as his sisters, with Ghost at his side from birth. He thought about what he would have been. Then he thought about Daenerys on a ship's deck telling him, "You are mine." Daenerys in a burning city holding him with both arms. Daenerys at a breakfast table saying, "Whatever else is true, that is true." Missandei teaching him High Valyrian in exchange for military history. Jorah in a training yard passing lessons through practice rather than instruction. The whole shape of the life he had actually lived. "I have no grievance," he said. He meant it. "The life I was given was the right life. I can't see the other one clearly enough to mourn it." Ned looked at him. "I know who my mother was now," Eamon said. "I know who my father was. I know who raised me and who gave me away and why, and all of it fits together into something I can stand in and look out from." He paused. "That's more than most people get." Ned Stark looked at him for a long time with his structural grief eyes, and the grief was still there. It was always going to be there. It had been there too long to leave. But alongside it now was something else. Something that had not been there before this conversation, or perhaps had been there in potential, waiting for exactly this exchange. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said, "not for the dragon or the claim or any of the dynastic implications." His voice was very quiet. "For who you are. She would be proud of who you are." The godswood held them above the Winterfell walls. Two ravens circled in the cold sky in the Wolfswood. Ghost raised his head and looked north at something neither of them could see. The dead were coming. The dead were always coming. But here, in the place where his blood knew the ground even if his feet had never touched it before, Aemon Targaryen, Jon Snow's true name, Lyanna Stark's legacy, Daenerys' son, Rhaegar's heir, and all of it, every piece without contradiction. Sat beside the uncle he had just found and breathed the cold northern air and did not look away from any of it. He had never been able to look away. It was, he had decided, the truest thing about him. The ravens came from the wall on a Tuesday. 3 of them in close succession, each carrying the same message in the cramped hand of the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. A man named Edison Tollett who had been writing the same message to the same unlistening Southern powers for 3 years and had apparently decided that persistence was the only tool remaining to him. The message was brief, which was the most frightening thing about it: the dead walk. "The wall will not hold the winter. Come now or do not come." Aemon read it in the Winterfell Meister's tower and then carried it to Sansa, and then sent a copy south to Dragonstone by Raven. And the whole day that followed was the kind of day in which the hours move with the strange, compressed urgency of time that knows itself to be limited. Daenerys' reply came 4 days later, which was as fast as the ravens could fly and return. It was a single page in her handwriting, which Aemon could have read blindfolded by the specific pressure of her pen on parchment. "I am coming north with Drogon and Viserion. Regal is yours. The Unsullied will hold the southern position. Tyrion manages King's Landing approach in my absence. I trust your read on the Northern Lords. Maintain whatever you've built there. I will arrive at Winterfell within the fortnight. Do not do anything irreversible before I arrive. D below this in smaller letters, as though added as an afterthought, though he knew it was not an afterthought. Be careful. The instruction stands. He folded the letter and put it in his coat against the left side of his chest, the place where the scar from Myrine was. She arrived on a Thursday, because the world does not time its significant moments for the convenience of narrative. He watched her come in from the Winterfell walls, Drogon descending first, enormous and black against the white sky, and then Viserion banking wide above the castle with the particular elegance he had always had. A quality of movement that Aemon had privately thought of as the dragon equivalent of Missandei's administrative precision. Everything in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Regal landed beside him on the wall and pressed its head against his shoulder with a warmth that was partly body heat and partly something else. The quality of presence the dragon had that was not animal instinct, but not quite consciousness either. Something between. The courtyard below became briefly magnificent in the way that any courtyard does when a 60-foot dragon sets down in it. He was on the steps when Daenerys came through the castle gates, and she crossed to him without ceremony, without the public dignity she usually maintained in new spaces, the composed authority of the queen presenting herself to new subjects, and looked at him with the full attention she reserved for things that actually mattered. You look northern, she said. He was wearing Winterfell-made clothing, the heavy wool, the furs. It's cold, he said. You look like you belong here, she said. Her voice was even, and he could not tell precisely what she meant by it, observation or accusation or grief or something else. I was thinking about that, he said, whether I belong here. And I think belonging is more complicated than a place, he said. I think I contain several belongings and none of them cancel the others. She looked at him for a moment. Then she put her hand briefly on his arm, the way she did when words were the smaller part of what she was saying, and the larger part was simply, I see you. And then the northern lords were waiting, and Sansa was descending the steps with the composed precision of a host who has been ready for this moment since the first raven arrived, and Daenerys became the queen and the moment passed. But it had happened. They told her together, he and Ned Stark, in the private chamber off the great hall that Sansa had designated for sensitive conversations, the room with thick enough walls that raised voices would not carry. He had discussed this with Ned in advance. Who spoke first, what order the information came in, how to give her the full picture without either of them managing her reaction by controlling the sequence. She did not need managing. She needed truth in its complete form and the space to receive it. Ned told his part, the Tower of Joy, the promise, the beach, the choice, in the measured northern way that did not editorialize and did not apologize in language, though the apology was in every word of it. Daenerys listened with her hands flat on the table and her face very still, which Aemon recognized as her processing face, the one she wore when something was too large to respond to immediately. When Ned was finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, You knew he was Rhaegar's son when you gave him to me. Yes, Ned said. You knew what that meant for the succession. Yes, and you gave him to me anyway. Ned met her eyes. You were family. You were his aunt. You were the right person. He paused. Robert would have killed him. Varys would have used him. You were the only person I could imagine raising him to be himself rather than a claim. Daenerys looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Aemon. He held her gaze and waited. You already knew all of this, she said. Yes. Since when? Since before we sailed. Tyrion told me, he paused. I told you at sea what Tyrion told me, what Tyrion told you, which was what you had already suspected. Yes, she absorbed this. He watched her absorb it, watched the various components settle into their positions and produce the understanding that came when information that has been coming in pieces finally assembles into a complete shape. You've known for a year, she said, and managed it. Her voice was entirely level. You managed the timing of when to tell me, managed the political context, managed, she stopped, not in anger, in something more complicated than anger. Yes, he said, he was not going to apologize for it. I did it because the fleet needed to sail and you needed to be able to sail it. I did it because the conversation we needed to have required space neither of us had on land. You were protecting me, she said. I was managing the timing, he said, which was what he had said to Tyrion and which was still true. Those are the same thing, she said. Which was what Tyrion had said. Yes, he agreed. They are. She was quiet again. Ned Stark sat across from her with the stillness of a man who has said what he came to say and is now providing the presence of a witness rather than contributing to the conversation. "What do you want?" Daenerys asked Aemon, the question she always asked when she was ready for the real conversation. "Not what the succession law says, what you want. I want the dead to be stopped," he said. "I want the realm to survive, I want you to be queen." He held her gaze, in that order. She looked at him. "That's the same answer you gave me on the ship." "It hasn't changed." "It should have," she said. A year later, more information, a war closer. "It hasn't changed," he said again. "I know what I want, I've known for a long time." She held his gaze for a moment that was long enough to contain several things. The 15 years behind them, the argument in the Myrine Council room, the field of fire in the Reach, the raven to Dragonstone and the one that came back. All of it passing through the space between them with the speed of things that do not need to be said to be fully present. "All right," she said. Then, to Ned, "Thank you for telling me, for being here to tell me." She paused, and when she continued there was something in her voice that was raw and honest and not quite controlled. "He's remarkable. Whatever you chose and why, he's remarkable. I thought you should know that the thing you gave me has become the best part of my life." Ned Stark looked at her. "I know," he said. "I've been watching." The army of the dead came over the wall on a Friday. It did not come where they expected. They had been watching the eastern approach, the passes nearest the ancient forts, the geography that every strategic model suggested was the natural funnel. The Night King brought his army through the western pass, which was less traveled and more treacherous, and apparently presented no difficulty to an army that did not fear treacherous terrain, because the terrain could not kill what was already dead. The ravens from the remaining Night's Watch outpost came at dawn. By mid-morning, the scouts confirmed what the ravens had said. By afternoon, the dead were 3 days' march from Winterfell. The war council that convened in the Great Hall was the largest Aemon had attended. Northern lords and unsullied commanders and Dothraki Khals and Daenerys' inner council, all of them in the same room with the same information and the same 3 days. He had been in this kind of council before. The quality of it was always the same. The moment when the abstract threat becomes concrete time, when eventually becomes Thursday, and the room has to reorganize itself around the new reality. He let the first hour run. Let the commanders speak. Let the assessments come in. Let the northern lords make their arguments about defensive positions, and let the Dothraki Khals make their arguments about offensive engagement, and let Tyrion, participating by Raven Relay through a system they had established for exactly this kind of distance council, make his argument about strategic reserves. Then Aemon spoke. "We can't hold Winterfell," he said. The room went quiet. "The dead don't tire," he said. "They don't need supply lines. They don't have deserters or morale problems or the 1,000 frictions that degrade an army over time. Every man we lose to them becomes one of them. A siege favors them in every dimension." He paused. "We have to fight them in the open, with fire from above, and we have to do it before they reach the castle walls." "In the open against an army of that size," Lord Glover started, "is less bad than the alternative," Aemon said. "Open ground with 3 dragons doing coordinated fire ahead of our infantry line reduces the dead's numbers faster than any defensive position we can construct." He looked at Daenerys. "We need all 3 dragons, from the first engagement." She held his gaze. He saw her run the calculation, the tactical risk of committing all 3 at once, the possibility of a coordinated Night King response, the strategic cost of losing a dragon in the engagement. He saw her run it and arrive at the answer before he spoke again. "All 3, she said. He nodded. Grey Worm said, "The Unsullied form the anchor, Dothraki on the flanks. The dragons hold the center of the dead's formation. The Night King will have a counter," Aemon said. "He always has a counter. We plan for 2 engagements, not 1. First engagement clears the infantry, he escalates. Second engagement is whatever he escalates with." He paused. "Bran will tell us what the escalation looks like. He's been watching." Bran, at the end of the table in his chair, said, "Ice spears. He'll bring down a dragon if he can." He said it without drama, which made it worse. "Aim for the second dragon, not the first. He'll expect you to protect the queen's mount." The room absorbed this. Daenerys said, "He'll go for Rhaegal." "Most likely," Bran said. Aemon said, "Then Rhaegal flies high and fast and doesn't give him the shot." He said it calmly. He felt something underneath the calm that he did not look at directly, the specific fear that lives below decision-making and is different from the decision-making itself, but is always present alongside it. And the Night King himself. Sansa said from her position at the far end of the table, not a council question exactly, but the right question. The dead stop when he dies. Everyone knows this. Who kills him? Silence. Bran said, the person who can get to him. The person who can get through his dead, Arya said. She was leaning against the wall behind her seat with her arms crossed, and she said it with the flat practicality of someone who has spent the last year thinking about exactly this problem. It's not a question of can kill him, it's can you get to him through everything between him and you. Dragonfire clears a path, Daenerys said. He'll be expecting dragonfire, Aemon said. He'll position himself where it can't reach him without risking the dragon. He thought through the tactical geometry. We need someone on the ground, close enough to use a conventional weapon once the path opens. Arya looked at him, he looked back at her. Dragonglass blade, he said. I have one, she said. I know, he held her gaze. You're the right person for it, your training, don't justify it to me, she said. I've already decided, he nodded, looked around the room, we planned for contingencies. He said, Arya is the primary approach. Aemon on Regal provides the aerial support to clear her path. Ground teams with Dragonglass. The Dragonglass weapons have been distributed, Sansa said. All Night's Watch veterans are armed. The Northern Lord's infantry has been resupplied. We're as ready as the timeline allows. Then we fight in 2 days, Daenerys said. Give the dead time to come to us on open ground north of the castle, not at the walls, the council agreed. The night before the battle, Aemon went to find Daenerys. She was in the highest tower of Winterfell, the one that looked north, and she was standing at the window looking at the dark beyond the castle lights with an expression he had learned to recognize over 15 years as the expression she wore when she was afraid and was not going to acknowledge it. He stood beside her and looked north. Tell me something true, she said. It was the thing she sometimes asked when the night was large and the pretenses were exhausting. The Reach is beautiful in the early morning, he said. Before the battle, I was thinking about it today. Green hills and everything gold from the dawn light, and it was completely quiet for about 20 minutes before anyone realized the engagement had started. She was quiet, listening. Regal made a sound I'd never heard before we launched, he continued. Not aggressive, not the hunting sound. Something more anticipatory, like the dragon could feel what was about to happen and was gathering itself. He paused. I felt it too, through the connection, the gathering. Are you frightened? She asked. Yes. Of tomorrow. Of what happens after tomorrow more, he said. Tomorrow is the dead. After tomorrow is the rest of Westeros, which is complicated in different ways. She turned to look at him. Tell me the true hard thing, she said, the specific request. The thing she asked when she needed the version of honesty that other people declined to offer. He looked at her. I'm afraid of what you'll become if it goes wrong, he said. Not if we lose, if we win, but it costs that takes something from you. He held her gaze. I've watched you across 15 years, I know how you hold loss. You turn it inward and it becomes something harder, and you use the hardness to keep going, which is a survival mechanism that has kept you alive and functioning in circumstances that would have broken most people. He paused. What I'm afraid of is that we lose someone tomorrow, Jorah Missandei, someone irreplaceable, and you turn it into iron the way you do, and the iron goes somewhere it shouldn't. She was very still. I'm not saying don't feel it, he said. I'm saying when the loss comes, and some loss will come, I need you to let me be beside it with you, not alone, not just you and the hardness of it. He paused. Because I've seen what alone does to you and I won't watch it if I can help it. Silence, the wind outside the tower. You're asking me to be weak in front of you, she said. I'm asking you to be real in front of me, he said. Which you have always been, which you should keep being, regardless of what tomorrow costs. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached out and took his face in both hands, the way she had when he was very small and she was checking him for damage, which was what it had started as and was now something different and more, the gesture of someone who is making sure the thing they love is still whole, still present. Still there, you are the bravest thing I have ever made, she said. And she meant it in the way that went past biology, past the specific truth that she had not made him in the physical sense, into the larger truth of what is made by love and time and the specific work of two people's sustained attention to each other. He put his hands over hers. Don't die tomorrow, he said. Working on it, she said. His own words from Myrine 12 years ago returned to him. She had remembered. She always remembered. The battle was 3 days long. He would think about this later, that he had expected it to resolve, the way battles usually resolve, into a single decisive engagement with a clear before and after. The battle for the dawn did not work that way. It moved in waves, the dead coming and the dead being burned and more dead coming. The 3 dragons working in coordinated patterns above the field, while the Unsullied held the anchor line, and the northern infantry fought with the disciplined ferocity of people who understand they are fighting for their own ground. The first day was the infantry of the dead. Gray, numberless, the particular horror of them, not the violence but the silence. They made no sound, no battle cries, no screams of pain, just the continuous grinding advance of an army that experiences no fear and no fatigue. Dragonfire worked. It worked absolutely. Nothing remained of what it touched. The Night King's army was large enough that absolute destruction needed to be applied continuously for hours before the numbers began to genuinely thin. Aemon flew regal in the coordinated patterns he and Daenerys had established, calling adjustments to the ground commanders through the signal system they had drilled. He found, in the air above the battle, that the fear he had felt the night before had transformed into something functional. Not its absence, but its conversion into the focused clarity of someone doing a specific thing in a specific moment. The future and its complications temporarily suspended by the immediate and concrete. On the second day, the Night King showed himself. He came from the north on a dead dragon, Viserion, reanimated, which produced a moment of grief and horror in both Aemon and Daenerys that they felt through the dragon bond before they saw it visually. A cold wrongness broadcasting through the connection between living dragons and their riders. Daenerys made a sound Aemon had never heard from her, brief, involuntary, immediately controlled, and Drogon responded by rising higher and faster with the urgency of a creature whose loss it also was. The Night King on dead Viserion was a different tactical problem than the Night King on the ground. He could reach the living dragons. He demonstrated this within the first hour, coordinate his ground army while simultaneously targeting the aerial threat. Rhaegal took the first ice spear on the left flank. Not the kill shot, the Night King had aimed for the base of the wing, and Aemon had felt the trajectory coming through some sense he couldn't name and had banked hard right in the half-second before impact, so the spear took the trailing edge of the wing rather than the joint. Rhaegal screamed, the specific sound of a dragon in pain, which Aemon had never heard before and which went through him like the sound had a physical dimension, and lost altitude, and they dropped 40 feet before the wing caught air again. Blood on the wing. Flying, but damaged. He brought Rhaegal down behind the infantry line, behind the burning barriers, where the healers had established a triage position and where he could assess the damage before deciding whether to go back up. The wound was real, a long tear in the membrane, and Rhaegal was grounded for the remainder of the second day. Aemon fought on foot. He had not planned to fight on the ground. He had planned to be in the air, providing the aerial support that was the primary tactical asset he brought to this engagement. The plan, encountering reality, had reorganized itself. He had a dragonglass blade and a sword and ghost beside him, and he moved through the battle the way Jorah had taught him, efficiently, with minimum effort spent on each engagement, conserving what could be conserved and spending what needed to be spent. The dead were individually less dangerous than a living fighter of equivalent size. They did not adapt, did not feint, did not respond to unexpected movements. They pressed forward, and that was all they did, and if you knew that, you could use it. Ghost was extraordinary. The direwolf moved through the dead's formations with a violence that was pure and unapologetic, and the dead, to Aemon's surprise, seemed to register Ghost in a way they did not register human fighters, a slight hesitation, a reorientation. As though the wolf's presence meant something in the framework through which they processed the world. The third day, the Night King came to the ground. He did it after Daenerys on Drogon had brought dead Viserion down in a confrontation that Aemon watched from the field below with the terror of someone who cannot intervene in the thing that is happening above them. The collision of fire and cold at altitude was visible from miles away. Dead Viserion fell. Daenerys brought Drogon down hard and low, and she was alive, unhurt, and the Night King was on the ground, Between the Night King and Arya Stark was approximately 200 reanimated dead. Aemon looked at the gap. He looked at Regal, whose wing had been dressed, and who was standing behind the burning barriers with the particular quality of stillness that dragons had when they were deciding something. He looked at the Night King, who was walking through his own army toward Daenerys with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never had to hurry. He ran toward the Night King. Not toward the gap, toward the flank, toward the point in the dead's formation where the press was thinnest. Ghost ran beside him. He hit the formation with the focused violence of someone who has been afraid for 3 days and has converted all of it. And he cut and moved and cut and moved, and Ghost tore through anything that tried to close on his left, and they made 20 yards in 2 minutes and 40 yards in 5. He could feel the dead's attention reorienting toward him, not all of them, but enough that the gap between the Night King and Arya became slightly less impossible. He did not look at Arya. He could not afford to look at anything except what was directly in front of him. He could only do what he was doing and trust that she was doing what she was doing, the two of them working the problem from different directions without coordination, except the coordination of people who have understood the same plan well enough to improvise within it. The Night King noticed him. He turned those empty blue eyes toward Aemon across the press of dead and raised his hand. The dead nearest Aemon turned, all of them. The full weight of the dead in a 30-foot radius redirected toward a single target, which was an experience he had no prior reference for, and which produced, in the second before the press closed on him, a very clear and simple thought. This is the escalation Bran mentioned. The fire hit from above. Not directed at him, directed at the ring of dead pressing toward him, Drogon's fire coming in a controlled arc that cleared the immediate press without touching the center point. Daenerys on Drogon above him, reading the field, making the call. The clearing lasted perhaps 8 seconds. 8 seconds was enough. He looked up and the Night King was looking at him. And across the field, through the gap, through the thinned line, with the knife she had been given in another life and carried through years of training that had remade her into something the original girl would not have recognized, Arya Stark was moving. The Night King turned back, too late. He woke to cold. He was on the ground, which he had not planned to be. The battle sounds around him had changed quality, less continuous, more fragmented, the specific sound of an army that has lost its organizing principle and is in the process of discovering this. Ghost was beside him, lying pressed against his side, warm and alive. He sat up slowly and took inventory of himself. A cut on his right thigh, not deep. Several bruised ribs. His left hand, the one with the mirroring scar, was bleeding from new damage that he didn't remember taking. The dead around him were still, all of them. He looked out across the field. The shapes that had been moving moments ago, or what felt like moments, the battle-time distortion that compressed hours and expanded seconds arbitrarily, were standing still. Falling still. Some toppling as the animation left them, the collapse of things that had been held upright by something that was no longer there. He understood. He turned his head and found, across the field, the small group converged on a figure on the ground, dark robes, absolute stillness, the specific stillness of the genuinely dead rather than the reanimated. And Arya Stark standing nearby with blood on her hands, and the expression of someone who has just done the thing they have been made for and is encountering the aftermath of it. He got to his feet. Ghost stood with him, unhurt except for the dried blood on his muzzle that was not his. They walked across the field together through the falling dead, and as he walked the sky above them lightened, east, then north, then the whole pale sweep of the Westeros dawn coming in over a field of what had been an army and was now nothing. He found Daenerys crouched near the fallen Night King, Drogon behind her making the low sound he made when he was close to something he considered significant. She was unhurt. She looked up when he approached and her eyes swept him, inventory-taking, cataloging. "Ribs," he said preemptively. "A few, nothing structural. Your hand." "Yes." She stood and crossed to him and took his damaged hand in both of hers and looked at it with the focused attention she gave to things she was deciding how to feel about. He let her look. "Arya did it," he said. "I saw." She was still looking at his hand. "I also saw you empty half the field to give her the opening. Grey Worm's anchor line held the other half." "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't minimize what you just did in front of me." He was quiet. "You walked into a ring of dead that was closing on you." She said, "You drew the Night King's attention fully enough that he turned his back on his own death." She paused. You knew what would happen if I didn't clear them fast enough. I knew you'd be fast enough. She looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, which she was not acknowledging, and her hands were still holding his. Around them the dawn was coming in fully now, the pale northern light finding the field and the fallen and the survivors moving through them. We need to find who we've lost, he said gently. Before you hold whatever this is. She closed her eyes, one breath, then yes, she let go of his hand. Yes, we do. They found Jorah near the eastern anchor line. He had died the way Jorah Mormont would have died, between Daenerys and whatever was trying to reach her. The position he had occupied for 20 years in every configuration the world had offered. He was lying on his back with his sword still in his hand, and the expression of someone who had stopped fighting in a moment between one breath and the next. Daenerys stood over him for a long time. Aemon stood beside her and did not speak and did not look away. He thought about a training yard in Pentos, a large knight with a patient manner and the habit of correction through practice rather than instruction. He thought about a terrace in Meereen and a hand briefly on his shoulder. He thought about the word lonely, which Jorah had used that day and which had been, in the end, less true than it might have been. He was not lonely at the end, Aemon thought. He was exactly where he chose to be. He loved you. He said because it was true and she knew it, and sometimes true things needed to be said aloud to be fully present. I know, she said. Her voice was the controlled voice, the iron voice. He waited. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, the iron, the control. Then it didn't. She made the sound that was neither quite a sob nor quite a cry, but was the sound underneath both. The raw foundational sound of genuine loss in a person who is accustomed to bearing loss alone. She made it once and then it was silent and she was herself again. But in the silence was the whole of it. The 20 years of Jorah's service, the 10 years of Aemon's presence, the accumulated loss of everything this campaign had cost and would cost. And she bore it in that one moment in the open rather than inward. He was beside her for it. He did not put his arm around her, did not speak, did not do anything that would have made it more performed and less real. He was simply there the way she had asked him to be the night before in the tower. After a moment she straightened. We have the living to attend to, she said. Yes, he said. They walked back through the field together toward the castle and the survivors, and the beginning of the work that comes after the thing everyone else will call the victory. The immunity was witnessed by 400 people. He had not planned this. He had not planned any of what had happened in the battle's final minutes in the particular sequence that had happened, and the immunity had presented itself as a fact of his circumstances rather than a choice. The Night King's last act before Arya reached him had been a wall of cold, not ice spear targeted, not directed at a specific threat, but broadcast, the general weaponization of absolute cold in a radius around himself. The temperature dropped catastrophically in the space of 10 seconds. Men near the Night King fell. Aemon was near the Night King, he did not fall. The cold touched him, he felt it, a pressure and a depth to the cold that was different from ordinary winter cold, something that went past temperature into something more fundamental. He felt it and he was still standing, Ghost pressed against his leg with the white fur bristling, both of them upright in a radius where everything else had gone down. He walked forward. He walked forward through the wall of cold and he drew the dragonglass blade and he was 3 steps from the Night King when Arya's knife found its mark. 400 people saw it. Soldiers, northern lords, unsullied Dothraki. 400 people who had been close enough to the epicenter of the event to see what happened in its last seconds. A man who walked through the cold that killed others. A man with a dragon. A man who was, provably and publicly, not exactly what he had appeared to be. Sansa came to him that evening in the private chamber with the expression of someone who has already catalogued the implications and is coming to present them. They saw, she said, yes. Half the northern lords are already talking. They saw the cold not affect you. They know who you are. The story is spreading faster than we can manage it. She paused. This is a political event now as much as a military one. I know. She looked at him steadily. What do you want to do with it? He thought about Daenerys. About the conversation ahead, which was the hardest and most necessary conversation, the one they had been building toward since Tyrion's dark ship cabin revelation. The conversation about what the immunity meant, about what the public knowledge of it meant, about whether the careful political architecture they had built across the last year could hold the weight of this new fact. I need to talk to Dany first, he said, before anyone else manages the story. Sansa studied him. She'll be angry, she'll be afraid, he corrected. Anger is what fear looks like when Daenerys is being a queen instead of a person. Sansa was quiet for a moment. Then, you know her very well. Yes, and she knows you. Yes, then perhaps. Sansa said, with the careful precision of someone advancing a position she is not sure will be received. The conversation will go better than you're expecting. He looked at her. She raised you, Sansa said. She has kept you beside her across 15 years and a continent and a war. People do not do that with things they are willing to lose. She paused. I have considerable experience with people who treat others as tools. Daenerys Targaryen does not treat you as a tool. He held her gaze. No, he said, she doesn't. Then whatever the political implications of tonight, between the two of you, I suspect the conversation will be less about power and more about something else. Yes, he said. He found Daenerys in the Winterfell godswood, which surprised him. She was not a person given to godswoods, to the northern spiritual practice that was as foreign to her as most things northern. But she was there, sitting on the stone bench where he had sat with Ned and with Bran, and she was looking at the heart tree with the expression she wore when she was in the middle of a thought too large to finish quickly. He sat beside her. She did not speak immediately. He waited. They saw. She said, yes, you walked through the cold. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. I felt it through Drogon, the cold wall. I felt it from above and I felt Drogon feel it, and I looked down and you were, she paused. You were still standing. Yes, you're fire immune, she said. We've both suspected that for years. The dragons, regal in the way, she stopped, and now cold immune as well, apparently. I don't know if cold immune is the right framing, he said. I felt it, it wasn't comfortable, it just didn't stop me. She looked at him. What does that mean? I don't know precisely, Bran might. Bran knows everything, apparently. She said it without bitterness, with something closer to the dry exhaustion of someone who has been receiving prophetic information for weeks and has developed a complicated relationship with certainty. She looked back at the heart tree. 400 witnesses, the story is spreading. Yes. There will be lords who use it, who take what they saw and construct a narrative about the trueborn heir walking through death unharmed because he is chosen, because the gods want. She stopped. Her jaw was tight, because it is his birthright. I know, he said, and you cannot stop them from telling that story. No, he paused, but I can tell a different one. She looked at him. A story about what I actually want and who I actually am, he said. Not a claim, not a rival. The queen's son, who also happens to be her nephew, who also happens to be immune to extreme cold, who helped clear a field so that Arya Stark could end the long night. He met her eyes. That's the story that's true, that's the one worth telling. Stories don't stay the shape you put them in. She said, people reshape them. Yes, he agreed, but you control more of it than you think if you move first and move clearly. She was quiet for a long time. The godswood was very still, the cold settling into the spaces between the trees with the gentleness of winter after battle, the kind of cold that is simply weather rather than weapon. I'm frightened, she said. She said it the way she had said things to him in private their whole lives, directly without the armor, in the voice that was only available in the space where she was not the queen. I know, he said. Not of you, she said quickly, the clarification urgent. Not, I know what you want and I believe you. I'm frightened of the world using you against me without your consent, of someone taking what you are and making it a weapon pointed at everything I've built. He held her gaze. Then we decide together how to tell the story, he said. You and I. Before anyone else decides for us. She looked at him for a long moment. The heart tree looked down at both of them with its carved grief. Tell me what you're thinking, she said, he told her. He laid out the political architecture as he saw it. The northern lords' likely positions, the southern lords' likely responses, the specific vulnerability of her claim, and the specific way the immunity story either threatened it or could be made to reinforce it, depending on how it was framed and by whom and when. He talked for perhaps 20 minutes, the way he always talked when he was working through a problem, clearly, sequentially, with the assumptions named and the uncertainties acknowledged. She listened. She interrupted twice with questions that refined his analysis. She added one consideration he had missed, the Dornish lords, whose relationship to Rhaegar's memory was complicated and particular, and who would respond to news of Rhaegar's son differently than any northern or river lord. They were doing what they had always done, planning together, thinking together, the queen and her son in a godswood after a battle that had just ended the long night, working the problem of what came next. After a while, she said, We'll need to hold a formal assembly. Northern Lords and the Dragonstone Council together. I'll present the succession question formally, acknowledge the claim, the legitimacy dispute, and my position on both." She paused. "And you'll stand beside me when I do it." "Yes," he said, "not as a rival, as what you are, as your son." He said. She looked at him. "I know what I am biologically," he said. "I know what the law says, and I am also, in the way that has been true since I was 6 weeks old on a ship going east, your son. Both things are true, neither cancels the other." She put her hand over his on the bench. Held it there. Outside the godswood, the castle was alive with the sound of survivors and the aftermath of battle and the long, ongoing work of people who have just lived through something enormous and must now figure out what comes next. "Both things are true," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then very quietly, in the voice that was only for him. "I held you when you were 6 weeks old and you looked at me and you didn't cry. You just watched me with those gray eyes, and I thought," she paused, "I thought, this is the thing I didn't know I needed. That's all, it was that simple." He looked at her. "I still think it," she said. He held her hand on the stone bench in the godswood in the cold that was only weather now. "I know," he said. "Me too." The night settled around them. Winterfell breathed and lived and began the long work of the morning. And in the morning, the world was still there, waiting to be dealt with. Spring came to Westeros the way it always came after a long winter, not gently, not as a gift, but as a slow insistence, the world pushing back against the cold with the particular stubbornness of something that has been suppressed long enough to have opinions about it. The snow receded by inches. The rivers remembered how to move. In the fields south of the neck, where the dead had not reached and the land had simply been waiting, the first green came up through the frost with the unsentimental practicality of life that does not require an audience. Aemon rode south through all of it and tried to see it clearly. He had been told Westeros was beautiful. He had been told this by Daenerys, who had never seen it either, and by Barristan, who had served here his whole life and carried the landscape in him like a wound that had never quite closed, and by Tyrion, who had the complicated relationship with beauty of someone who had grown up surrounded by it and been taught to see himself as not belonging to it. None of their descriptions had adequately prepared him for the reality of it, the sheer scale, the variety. The way the land changed character every 50 miles with the insistence of something that had been many different things for many different people, and had decided to remain all of them simultaneously. He rode south with Ghost at his left and Regal overhead, the dragon's wing heeled now but carrying a slightly different quality of movement, a careful asymmetry in the way he banked that had not been there before the battle. The wound had closed. The scar remained. Aemon understood this completely. The assembly at Winterfell had gone better than he had planned for and worse than he had hoped for, which was the standard outcome of events involving large groups of people and contested political realities. Daenerys had stood before the Northern Lords and her own council in the Great Hall on the morning after the battle's end, with Aemon beside her and Sansa at the table, and Tyrion's voice arriving through the Raven relay that his people had maintained across the distance. And she had told them everything, not the version edited for palatability, everything. She had told them that Aemon Targaryen was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, legitimately born and given to her care as an infant by Ned Stark, who was present and confirmed it with the flat northern certainty of a man who has been telling the truth for so long he has forgotten how to do anything else. She had told them what the succession law said about Aemon's claim versus her own. She had told them her position, that she did not intend to step aside, that she had spent her life building toward the governance of this realm and believed herself the right person for it, and that she was stating all of this openly rather than managing the information because she had decided, some years ago, that she was done governing through concealment. She had said, "Aemon Targaryen does not want the throne. He has told me this directly, and I believe him. I am telling you both things, the claim and its renunciation, so that no one can use either piece of information against either of us without your already having the full picture." The room had been very quiet, Lord Manderley had said. Lyanna Stark's son walked through the cold that felled grown men. "Yes," Daenerys said, "and sits beside you rather than across from you." "Yes." Manderley had looked at Aemon for a long moment. "What do you want, boy, in your own words?" Eamon had not been a boy for some time, but he understood what Manderley was doing, using the diminutive to produce a response, to see whether the response would be defensive or assured. He had let it pass. "I want the realm to be ruled well," he had said. "I want the people in it to be less subject to the accidents of their birth. I want the war that just ended to stay ended, which requires governance that the small folk can believe in rather than merely endure." He had held Manderley's gaze. "I want my mother to be queen. I believe she is the right person for it. Everything else I want is downstream of those things." Manderley had looked at him for a long time, then he had said, "The North supports Queen Daenerys Targaryen and her son." The other lords had followed. Not unanimously, Lord Glover had remained abstaining, which was Glover's right, and which Eamon had noted for future reference without present concern, but substantially. The weight of northern opinions settling behind the position Manderley had articulated with the particular momentum of northern decisions once made. The assembly had not resolved everything. It had never been going to resolve everything. But it had resolved the central question, whether the Northern Alliance held in the direction that mattered, and everything else was a problem for the road south. The road south was long, and the problems were numerous, and Tyrion, reunited with them in person when the fleet met them at the neck, had opinions about all of them. "Cersei is the smaller problem," Tyrion said, on their third evening of southward march. He was riding in the supply wagon that he had claimed as his mobile office, surrounded by papers that Eamon suspected were arranged in an order that made sense only to Tyrion. "Cersei is holding King's Landing with the gold cloaks and whatever is left of the Lannister army, which is not nothing but is considerably less than it was. She has the city's food supply controlled, and she'll use that as a negotiating position." He paused. "What she doesn't have is a coherent plan for what happens after. She's been reactive for a year, and reactive strategies exhaust themselves." "What does she want?" Eamon asked. He was sitting on his horse beside the wagon, which was the conversation position he had defaulted to with Tyrion over months of this arrangement. "To survive," Tyrion said. "Fundamentally and always to survive. The throne is a mechanism for survival." If she could be convinced that a different mechanism served the same purpose, he trailed off. "She won't be convinced, I know my sister, but the logic is there if someone wanted to attempt it." "I want to attempt it," Eamon said. Tyrion looked at him. "She'll see it as a performance." "She'll see a dragon army as an inevitability," Eamon said. "What I can offer her that the army can't is a choice. People respond differently to choices than they do to inevitabilities, even when the outcomes are the same." Tyrion was quiet for a moment. "You want to go in alone." "Not alone. With Ghost." "The wolf is not a substantial military reassurance. It's not meant to be, it's meant to demonstrate that I'm not there to threaten her." He paused. "I'm there to offer her the only version of this that ends with her alive." Tyrion looked at him for a long moment. "Daenerys knows about this plan. We've discussed it." "That's not an answer." "We've discussed the general principle," Eamon said. "The specific operational details are still being worked out." "That's also not an answer," Tyrion said. But he did not say no, which was Tyrion's way of saying, "I think this might work, and I don't want to be responsible for having endorsed it." Daenerys was not pleased with the operational details. She was not pleased in the specific way that came from having thought through the risks faster than he had presented them, which was always the version of her displeasure that was hardest to navigate because it was most substantively grounded. "You want to go into the Red Keep alone," she said, "with Ghost. With a wolf." She was using the voice, the iron voice. "Into a fortress held by a woman who has survived every threat made against her for 20 years by being willing to do whatever was necessary." "Yes, and your plan is to—" "Offer her terms," he said. "Publicly in person before we commit the army to a direct assault. Give her the genuine choice of yielding rather than forcing her to make an example." He met her eyes. "If she yields, we take the city intact, no bells, no fire." "No, nothing that becomes the story people tell for 100 years about how Daenerys Targaryen came home." She was quiet. "I know what you're thinking about," he said gently. "The vision you told me about from Karth years ago, the Red Keep in ashes." She looked at him. "That doesn't have to be how this goes," he said. "It can go differently if we make it go differently." He paused. "That's what you've been doing your whole life, making things go differently than they were supposed to." "By going into a castle alone," she said. "This is your method." "Cersei is a rational actor," he said. "She can be shown a calculation that makes surrender preferable to resistance." What she can't be shown that calculation by is an army at her gates or a dragon overhead. Those things make her defiant because they give her no face-saving alternative. A single person walking in is, potentially a person walking into a trap. Yes, he said, potentially. Which is why Ghost comes, and why I'll have the first 3 levels of the keep cleared by Grey Worm's advance team before I go further in, and why Regal will be visible from every window of the Red Keep for the duration of the conversation. He held her gaze. I've thought this through. I know you have, she said. That's not the same as it being safe. No, he agreed, it's not. She was quiet for a long time. The camp around them was settling into its evening rhythms, the sounds of a large army making itself comfortable for the night, which was a sound Eamon had become so accustomed to over the past year that the absence of it in Winterfell's fortress quiet had initially felt strange. If something happens to you, she said, it won't. If something happens to you, she said again, the emphasis clarifying that this was not an invitation to reassurance but a conditional that she needed to complete. I will burn every stone of that keep to the waterline, and I need you to know that before you go in. He looked at her. I know, he said, which is why nothing will happen to me. She looked at him for a long time. Then she exhaled, one controlled breath, the deliberate release of someone who has decided to trust a thing and is marking the moment of decision. Come back, she said. Always, he said. King's Landing smelled of the sea and smoke, and the particular density of a city that has been holding itself together through force of will for too long. The harbor was still. The streets visible from Regal's altitude as they approached were not empty. The city was alive. 1 million people going about the careful business of living in a city that was technically at war, but they had the quality of streets where people are moving quickly and looking at the ground. Grey Worm's advance team had spent 2 days before Eamon's arrival doing the work he had asked for, securing the lower levels of the keep, establishing a perimeter that was military fact rather than military theater, removing the gold cloaks from the specific corridors through which Eamon would walk. The message had been sent to Cersei. The Queen's son will enter the Red Keep at the 3rd hour. He comes to speak, not to threaten. He will be unaccompanied except for his wolf. The reply had been 3 words, in a hand he had not seen before, but that Tyrion confirmed was Cersei's own. Let him come. He entered through the main gate. This was deliberate. He could have entered through a side passage, through the servants' entrance, through any of the half-dozen secured access points that Grey Worm's team had established. He entered through the main gate because entering through the main gate was the statement that he was not hiding, not maneuvering, not doing anything except exactly what he had said he was doing. Ghost walked beside him. The wolf had been quiet since entering the city, which was different from his Winterfell quiet, not the quiet of comfortable familiarity, but the alert quiet of a creature that has assessed an environment and decided it requires attention. The keep was stripped of ostentation in a way that spoke to the months it had been under siege conditions. The tapestries were still there, the stone was still the stone of centuries, but the quality of maintenance had slipped in the particular way that reveals how much of grandeur is continuous labor rather than inherent permanence. The torches were lit, but conservatively. The servants they passed moved with the practiced invisibility of people who have learned that visibility is risk. Cersei was in the throne room. He had expected this and had prepared for it, had thought through the symbolic weight of a meeting in the throne room versus a meeting in a private chamber, had decided that the throne room was her choice to make, and that accepting it without comment was the correct response. That treating it as the power move it was would give it more weight than letting it simply be the room she had chosen. The Iron Throne was everything the descriptions had said, and nothing they had adequately conveyed. It was not beautiful. It had never been meant to be beautiful. It was made from the swords of a king's defeated enemies, 1,000 blades folded into a seat, and beauty was not the point. The point was that it hurt to sit in. The point was that the act of ruling was supposed to hurt, which was either the most honest thing anyone had ever built into an institution or the most self-servingly masochistic, depending on your interpretation. Cersei was sitting in it. She was 50 years old and had the appearance of someone who has maintained themselves with the focus of someone who considers their own presentation a strategic asset, which she always had and evidently still did regardless of circumstances. Her hair was shorter than the portraits. Her eyes were the green that every account mentioned, and they were watching him with the comprehensive attention of a woman who has spent her whole life reading rooms and the people in them, and has learned to do it quickly because slow reading is a luxury she has rarely had. Ghost sat at Eamon's left and looked at Cersei with the calm assessment of a creature that has already decided the level of threat and found it manageable. "You're younger than I expected," Cersei said. Her voice was even, no particular inflection, a statement of observation. "You're not what I expected either," he said. "What did you expect?" "Something more theatrical," he said honestly. "The stories about you emphasize a certain dramatic quality," she said, a faint, mirthless something in her expression that was not quite a smile. "I've had a long year." "Drama is expensive." She looked at him with those green eyes. "You have the Targaryen look, the dark hair doesn't hide it, the bone structure, the way you carry yourself." A pause, and something else, something more northern. "My mother was Lyanna Stark," he said. "I know who your mother was." She said it without particular heat. "I've known who you were since before you knew yourself." She paused. "Did you know that Varys had a file on the child sent east?" He showed it to Robert once. Robert looked at it and decided it was too uncertain. The child might have been anyone. Ned Stark might have been protecting a servant's bastard. Robert preferred uncertainty to another war. She looked at the wolf. "That wolf, is that what I think it is, a dire wolf?" "Yes, south of the wall." She said, "An omen, apparently." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you offering?" He appreciated the directness. He had thought she might require more preamble, more performance, more of the elaborate posturing that political negotiations usually demanded before arriving at their actual subject. She was apparently as tired of it as he was. "Your life," he said. "Yours and your son's." He paused, choosing the next words carefully, aware that the status of Cersei's children was a complicated question. "Your families. Safe passage from King's Landing to wherever you choose. A settlement of reasonable personal wealth. Formal terms of surrender that preserve your dignity as a former queen rather than process you as a war criminal." She looked at him. "In exchange for—" "The city," he said. "Intact, the gold cloaks standing down, the gate opened, every person in King's Landing alive when we enter." Silence. The throne room was very quiet. Somewhere outside its walls, 1,000,000 people were living their lives in the particular suspended state of a city that knows a decision is being made about it somewhere above its head. "My son will never be safe," she said. "As long as there are people who believe his father's line should end, he will never be safe." "His father's line is complicated," Aemon said. "I'm aware of that better than most." He held her gaze. "Daenerys Targaryen does not want your son's death. She wants the war to stop. She wants to rule what she spent her life trying to rule. Your son is not a threat to that. A child in exile is not a threat to an established queen with 3 dragons. She has said that, or you are saying it for her." "Both," he said. "I would not come here to say something she wouldn't confirm." Cersei looked at him for a long time. She had the gaze of someone who has been lied to by people who were better at performing honesty than he was, and who has therefore become very good at looking for the seam between performance and truth. He held it steadily and let her look. "You believe what you're saying," she said. It seemed to surprise her slightly. "Yes. Most people who come to negotiate don't believe what they're saying. They believe the outcome they want, and they believe the other person is an obstacle to it. I believe you're a rational person who will make the calculation that yields the best result for the people you actually care about," he said. "If you make that calculation, you'll yield. If you let pride make the calculation, we'll fight and the people of this city will suffer for it, and the outcome will be the same except worse for everyone." "Pride," she said. The word had a particular quality in her mouth, not contempt exactly, but the acknowledgement of something that has both served her and cost her across a life long enough to have experienced both dimensions of it. "I know something about that," he said. "About the pull of it. About the way it dresses itself in other languages, dignity, honor, principle, and about the cost of letting it make decisions that other parts of you would make differently." She studied him. "You're not what I expected," she said again. "You said that already." "It bears repeating." She was quiet for a moment. "My son goes with me. Wherever safe passage means he goes." "Yes. The wealth settlement is negotiated, not dictated." "Yes." He had anticipated this. Tyrion had prepared a range, and the terms of surrender are— She stopped, started differently. "They are recorded as a negotiated conclusion rather than a capitulation." "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what they'll be recorded as, because that's exactly what they are." She looked at him. Then she looked at the iron throne beneath her, at the thousand blades of it, the brutal, impractical reality of it. The thing she had spent her life reaching toward and had reached, and had held for years with the grip of someone who knows that the holding is the only thing between her and a fall she will not survive. She stood. It was not a dramatic gesture. She did not make a speech. She rose from the throne with the composed movement of a woman who has decided something and is not going to perform the decision for an audience, and she descended the steps, and she crossed the throne room, and she said, "Send your terms to my chambers, I'll review them tonight." "Yes," he said. She paused beside him. They were nearly the same height, he and Cersei Lannister, which he hadn't expected, and looked at him one more time. Up close her eyes were extraordinary, the green of them, and in them he saw the thing he had seen in the eyes of every person who had survived impossible circumstances. Not strength exactly, not courage in the heroic sense, but the specific quality of people who have been through the fire and are still standing and have decided that still standing is enough, that it is in fact the whole of what was required. "You should know," she said quietly, "that the city is glad it's ending. Whatever I've told them, they know." "People always know," she paused. "They'll be glad it's you rather than the other version." He did not say what other version. He knew what other version. He had spent a year trying to ensure the other version didn't arrive. "Thank you," he said, "for receiving me." She made a sound that might have been acknowledgement and walked away through the throne room's side door. And Ghost watched her go with the calm assessment of a creature that has decided a thing is no longer a threat. And Aemon stood alone in the throne room of the Red Keep with the Iron Throne behind him. He turned and looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about Daenerys, who had wanted it since before she understood what wanting was. He thought about Rhaegar, who had apparently never wanted it and had spent his life trying to avert the catastrophe he saw coming. He thought about Lyanna Stark, who had made a choice that everyone else called a tragedy and that he was increasingly sure she had considered a different kind of thing, not a tragedy but a wager, made with full knowledge of the odds, on the possibility that something worth protecting might survive. He thought, it is a poor seat for love, and everything worth doing is downstream of love, and therefore it is a poor seat for everything worth doing. He thought, it was never mine. He turned away from it and walked out of the throne room with Ghost beside him, and the city outside was quiet and alive and waiting. King's Landing opened its gates the next morning, not with fanfare, with the particular exhausted relief of a city that has been holding its breath and has finally been given permission to breathe. The gold cloaks stood down in the order they had been stationed, gate by gate, ward by ward, the organized yielding of a force that had been told by its queen to yield and that was, in the main, glad to have been told. They were not Cersei's men in the ideological sense. They were men who had jobs that they performed and who had been performing them under difficult circumstances for a year and who were ready for the circumstances to change. Grey Worms Unsullied entered first because the Unsullied were what they were, the most disciplined military force in the world, and discipline in the moment of entering a conquered city was the most important quality any army could have. They moved through the streets in formation, maintaining order, not taking, not punishing, not doing anything except being present with the controlled authority of soldiers who understood that their job was to protect rather than to demonstrate. Daenerys entered on horseback. She had considered Drogon. She had discussed it with Aemon, who had said, "On horseback you are a person arriving. On Drogon you are a force arriving. This city needs a person right now." She had looked at him for a long moment and then asked Missandei to arrange a suitable horse. She rode through the gates on a dark bay mare with Aemon beside her and Missandei behind her and Tyrion behind that. And the people of King's Landing watched from the sides of the streets and the upper windows and the rooftops, and the watching was not joyful, not yet, not spontaneously. The wounds too recent and the fear too long-standing for immediate joy, but it was not hostile either. It was watching. Cautious, assessing, the careful watching of people who have been given a new fact and are in the process of deciding how to feel about it. A child, small enough that the crowd around her hadn't managed to keep her back, ran forward from the street's edge. She was perhaps 6 years old, with the look of the city's small folk, the lean, practical look of people who have been making do for a very long time. She ran forward and held up something toward Daenerys, a flower, retrieved from somewhere, A yellow thing that had survived the winter with the persistence of things that do not understand they are supposed to give up. Daenerys stopped her horse. She looked at the child for a moment with the expression he knew, the one beneath the queen, the one that was simply the person she was when she forgot to manage the distance. She leaned down from the saddle and took the flower. The crowd watched this. Something in the watching changed. Not dramatic. It was never going to be dramatic. Not here, not yet, but changed, the way the quality of light changes when a cloud moves past the sun. The same world, but suddenly more visible in it. Aemon looked at Daenerys accepting a yellow flower from a 6-year-old in the street of a conquered city, and thought, this is the version. This is the right version. This is what we came for. The work of the city began immediately, because it always did. There was no pause for ceremony, no interlude of triumph before the demands of governance reasserted themselves. The city had needs: food distribution, the restoration of normal commerce, the establishment of a new judicial authority to replace the old. The specific and complicated problem of what to do with the red, keep staff and records, and the accumulated institutional knowledge of a castle that had been running the realm for 300 years. Aemon worked. He worked the way he always worked, continuously, with the focused practicality of someone who understands that the unglamorous things are the actual things, the things that determine whether the glamorous moments mean anything in the end. Missandei ran the administrative transition with the precise competence she had demonstrated in every city they had passed through, establishing the new structures with a speed that routinely amazed the people being organized by them. Grey Worm managed the military transition with his characteristic economy of expression and extravagance of effectiveness. Tyrion, installed in a set of rooms in the castle that he had selected himself on grounds he described as purely practical, and that Aemon suspected had strong aesthetic criteria operating below the stated logic, worked the political transition. The reorientation of the great house's relationships and expectations. The management of lords who had served Cersei and were now reconsidering the direction of their loyalty with the anxious attentiveness of men who have made one expensive political miscalculation and are determined not to repeat it. Daenerys ruled. She held court daily, in the throne room but not from the throne. She had looked at the Iron Throne on her first morning in the Red Keep with a particular expression, and then said to Aemon, "It's everything I thought it would be and not what I wanted." She had held court from a chair positioned at the room's front, slightly raised, with the throne visible behind her as a fact of the room rather than the thing she was using. Several courtiers had noted this arrangement with the anxious attention of people trying to determine what it signified. Aemon had overheard 3 different interpretations, none of which were correct. What it signified was that she had sat in a chair because she did not want to cut herself on the Iron Throne in front of an audience on her first day of court, which was a completely practical decision that she had not explained, because explaining it would have made it a statement rather than a choice. He had not explained it either. The Dornish lords arrived 2 weeks after the city's opening, which was exactly the timeline Aemon had predicted to Tyrion and slightly faster than Daenerys had expected. They came with the particular energy of people who have been waiting for an opportunity to be relevant and have finally identified one, which was the Dornish political character in general. A culture that had spent 300 years developing very sophisticated opinions about Targaryen dynasties while being technically outside of one. The Dornish reaction to Aemon was the one he had prepared for, and that had still surprised him in its specificity. Prince Doran Martell was dead, but his representative, a sharp-eyed woman named Illyria Sand, who had navigated the collapse of the Martell political structure with extraordinary pragmatic creativity, looked at Aemon with the expression of someone who has just been handed a piece of information that reorganizes a calculation they've been running for years. "Rhaegar's son," she said, in private after the formal reception. She had requested a private meeting with the directness of someone who does not see a reason to be indirect. "Yes," he said, "Elia Martell's husband's son." She said it without obvious emotion, which itself was a kind of emotion, the controlled quality of someone who has processed a complex grief and emerged on the other side of it into something more functional. "Not by Elia," he said. "I know what that means to Dorne. Do you?" "I know what Elia meant to Dorne," he said. And I know what Rhaegar's abandonment of her meant, regardless of the political complexities of why, and I know that my existence is, from a certain perspective, a continuation of the thing that began with that abandonment. He held her gaze. I can't undo what happened. I can tell you what I am and what I intend, and you can decide what Dorne does with it. She studied him for a long moment. You look like him, she said. Around the eyes, I saw Rhaegar once when I was very young. A pause. He was beautiful and he was already looking at something else, even then, always at something else. I've been told that about him, Eamon said, by people who knew him. Does that bother you? Yes, he said, and I try to understand what it meant without letting it be all it means. He paused. He loved my mother, I believe that. What it cost Aaliyah doesn't change that, and that doesn't change the cost to Aaliyah. Ilaria Sand looked at him. Dorne will support the queen, she said, and her son. She said the last two words with a slight emphasis that acknowledged the complexity of the title while declining to contest it. On the condition that the justice owed to Aaliyah Martell and her children is formally acknowledged in the Crown's records. Done, he said. She looked at him. That was faster than I expected. It's a just request, he said. It should have been acknowledged years ago. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you're different from what I expected. He had heard this enough now that he was beginning to wonder what everyone expected before they met him. He had decided it was probably something with more drama and fewer logistics. The formal assembly came 5 weeks after the city's opening. Daenerys had planned it with the comprehensive precision she brought to events that were both political acts and symbolic ones, understanding that the two dimensions required different preparation and that both needed to be right simultaneously. The great lords of Westeros were assembled, northern Dornish, the remaining river lords, the Vale, the compromised Reach, the fragmented Stormlands in the throne room that had held such assemblies for 3 centuries. She stood before them, not in the throne, in the chair that had been her court position since the first day. And she laid out the governance structure she intended to establish with the clarity of someone who has been thinking about this for 20 years and has finally arrived at the moment to say it. She talked about the small council's restructuring. She named her council members, which included no surprises to anyone who had been paying attention. She talked about the regional autonomy she intended to restore to the great lordships in exchange for their contribution to a standing military force that would replace the old feudal levy system. She talked about the Iron Throne's position on the rights of freed people, which was not a small statement in a hall that contained lords whose economies had, until recently, depended on unfree labor from across the narrow sea. Then she talked about the succession. She said, "The question of succession has been asked of me in every private meeting I have held since entering this city, and I am going to answer it publicly so that no one needs to ask it privately again." She paused. Aemon Targaryen is Rhaegar Targaryen's trueborn son and carries a succession claim that the law of Westeros would, in a strict reading, place above my own. He has renounced this claim in full knowledge of what it means and what it is. I am presenting this publicly because I have decided that governing through information management produces the kind of court I have no interest in running. You deserve to know what the claim is and what has been done with it. The room was very quiet. What I ask of this council, she continued, is not that you forget the claim exists, but that you accept the choice that has been made about it, and that you understand, from Aemon's conduct in this city, at Winterfell, on the battlefield, across the year of this campaign, what kind of person has made that choice and why. Aemon stood beside her. He had stood beside her in formal settings since he was old enough to stand still through them. 20 years of practice at being present without performing, and he brought everything those years had built to this moment. Steady, attentive, the person who was there because he chose to be. Because he was her son, and this was where her son stood. Lord Manderley spoke first, as he had at Winterfell. He had the seniority and the specific quality of authority that northern lords carry into southern rooms, the particular credibility of men who have ruled difficult places and are not easily impressed. The North has already answered this question, he said. We support Queen Daenerys and her son. That position doesn't change because we're south of the neck. The Vale Lord followed, then the River Lords, the ones who had survived and were rebuilding, then Ilaria Sand for Dorne with the precise phrasing they had agreed on in private. The Reach was last, and complicated, and Lord Tarley's successor. A young man who had inherited a lord's seat at the age of 19 and was dealing with it with the visible determination of someone who knows they have to be more than they currently are. Looked at Eamon with the specific expression of someone who has made a calculation and arrived at his position through reason rather than sentiment. "The Reach supports Queen Daenerys," he said, "and acknowledges Prince Aemon Targaryen as her named heir pending other succession." The room absorbed named heir. The specific construction of it, not the senior claimant superseded, not the renounced rival, but the heir named and acknowledged. Daenerys had not discussed this possibility with him. He looked at her. She looked at him with the expression that was the private one, the one beneath the queen, the one that had always been only his. She had done this deliberately. Had calculated that the room would move toward this construction if left to move, and had left it to move. Prince Aemon. She said to the room, "My son and my heir." She paused. "For whatever that is worth, from a woman who intends to be very hard to succeed." The room, cautiously, with the northern winter quality of northern lords deciding to approve of something, approved. He found her that evening on the ramparts. The Red Keep's ramparts looked west over the city and south over the bay and north up the river. And in the evening light the view was everything that the histories had described, the city enormous and real, the bay enormous and real, the sky doing the specific thing it does over water at sunset. The colors moving through each other with the unhurried extravagance of nature that has no political considerations. 3 dragons were in the sky. Drogon and Viserion circled far out over the bay, the great arcs of their flight catching the last light on their scales. Rhaegal was closer, above the keep, the asymmetry of the heeled wing visible in the slight drift of his banking, the beautiful imperfection of a creature that had been wounded and had decided that being alive was more important than being unmarked. Ghost was at Aemon's feet, looking north with the particular attention he had given to the north since Winterfell, the attention of a creature that knows something lives in that direction and is not yet entirely sure it is over. Daenerys stood at the parapet's edge with her hands on the stone and the wind off the water in her hair, which she had not fixed. He stood beside her. Below them, the city moved in its evening patterns, the millions of small lights coming on in the windows, the smoke from cooking fires, the sound that a city makes when it is simply living rather than surviving, the enormous ordinary sound of people getting through their days. "It's real," she said. "Yes. I've been telling myself that all day," she said. "In every meeting, every reception, every council session, I've been saying to myself, this is real, this is happening, we are here." She paused. "It hasn't quite arrived yet, the full reality of it." "It will," he said. "It usually takes longer than you expect." She looked at him. "When did it arrive for Meereen, the full reality?" He thought about it. "The 3rd month," he said. "When the first community council held a session without any of us present and resolved a dispute and it held, that's when it became real. When it started doing itself." 3 months, she said, give or take." She looked back at the city. "I've been wanting this my whole life," she said. "Since before I understood what wanting was. Since Viserys told me about the dragon skulls in the throne room and described King's Landing like a place that was mine by right, and all I had to do was reclaim it." She paused. "I thought it would feel complete. I thought there would be a moment of completion. And it feels like the beginning of an enormous amount of work," she said, "which I think might be the same thing for people like us." He looked at her. "People like us. People who are only happy when they're in the middle of something," she said, "who find peace in work rather than rest." She glanced at him sideways. "Don't tell me you found a way to rest. I'll be envious." "I find Ghost restful," he said. "You find Ghost restful because he doesn't require anything of you except presence." "Yes," he said, "that's what rest is." She was quiet, and he could see her turning this over, adding it to the collection of things she had learned from him that she had not expected to learn. "The named heir," he said. "Yes, you didn't discuss that with me." "No," she agreed. She did not apologize for it, which was honest. "I calculated that the room would arrive there on its own terms, and that arriving on its own terms was better than any version where it was proposed in advance. I was right." "You were right," he said, "and I would have objected if you'd proposed it, which is why I didn't propose it." She met his eyes fully, the private look. "Are you angry?" He thought about it seriously. "No," he said. "I should probably examine whether I should be, and I don't think I am." He paused. "I understand why you did it, and you were right that it was better this way. It changes things," she said. "Yes, for you specifically." She held his gaze. Named heir means named heir. It means a role, not just a presence. It means the work becomes more formal, more political, more visible, he said. Yes, I know. He was quiet for a moment. I've been working toward this city my whole life too, Danny. Not the throne, not the claim, but this specific work, this specific problem, the realm and its people and the question of whether it can be governed well. He paused. Named heir gives me more access to that work, not less. I can function more effectively with formal standing than without it. He looked at her. You know that. That's also why you did it. She held his gaze for a moment. You knew what I was doing. While you were doing it, yes. And you let me, you were right, he said. I told you. Something moved through her expression, the private thing, the thing that had always been between them, the specific quality of two people who know each other with the depth that comes from years and honesty and sustained mutual attention. The throne is a poor seat for love, she said. He recognized it, something Barristan had said once, many years ago, about some long-dead king, a throwaway observation that had apparently lodged in her memory the way things that are true tend to lodge. Yes, he said, you've always known that. I've always been more interested in the love than the throne, he said. You've always known that about me. She looked at him. Then she looked at the city, at the 3 dragons in the sky, at the bay going dark with the last of the light. I have something for you, she said. She reached into her coat and produced a piece of folded parchment and held it out. He took it. He unfolded it. It was a letter, in a hand he did not recognize, cramped, northern, the hand of someone who had written carefully, choosing every word with the deliberateness of people who do not use words decoratively. It was from Ned Stark. Eamon, I have been trying to write this letter since Dragonstone. I have written 12 versions. This is the 13th, which the old stories say is the one that holds. I gave you away because I could not keep you. I kept you because I could not forget you. These are not contradictions. They are the 2 true things of the last 17 years, and I have carried both of them, and I will carry them until I die, which is as it should be. You have become something I could not have predicted. I mean that as a compliment of the highest order. The things I could not have predicted about you are the best things about you. Your mother would have loved you. She would have argued with you constantly and loved every minute of it. She would have called your practicality cold-blooded and your honesty devastating, and she would have been proud of both. I am proud of both. I do not ask anything of you. You owe me nothing. I gave you away, and you have built yourself without me, and you have built yourself well. If there is anything I can do for you from Winterfell, any service the North can offer, any counsel I can give, anything that a tired old lord with a wolf-blooded family can provide, it is yours. Your uncle, Eddard Stark, he read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and held it in both hands and looked at the city below, at the beginning of an enormous amount of work, at the sky where the dragons circled in the evening light. He gave it to me at the assembly, Daenerys said quietly, before the lords arrived. He asked me to give it to you this evening. A pause. He said, when the day's business is done and there's time to read it properly. Eamon nodded. He did not speak for a moment because there was nothing to say that would be smaller than the moment, and he had learned, over a lifetime of paying attention, to let the moments that were large enough be large. He's a good man, he said finally. Yes, she said, he is. They stood in the evening quiet, the city below and the dragons above and the bay going dark and the first stars coming out over the water. And the letter in his hands and the scar on his forearm and ghost at his feet, and everything they had built together present in the air around them like something with its own warmth. She put her hand on his, not briefly this time. She left it there the way you leave something somewhere when you intend it to stay. You could have taken it from me, she said. It was the quiet voice, the voice that was only here, only this. He looked at her. She was 50 years of choices in a face that still had the quality of someone who has not yet finished deciding what she is, which had always been the most extraordinary thing about her, the refusal to be finished. I never wanted the throne, Mother, he said. I wanted to deserve the name. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her receive it, not the words, she knew the words. They had been the understanding between them for years, but the fact of it spoken plainly in this place at the end of this day. You always have, she said. Below them, the city breathed and lived. Above them, the dragons turned slow circles in the last light. The bay went dark, and the stars came fully out, and the night settled over King's Landing as it had for 3 centuries, indifferent to dynasties and claims, and the complicated human business of deciding what to love and what to build and what to protect. The wind off the water was mild. Spring, arriving in its slow, insistent way. Ghost lifted his head, satisfied with whatever he had been watching for, and lay back down against Eamon's feet with the comfortable weight of a creature that has decided it is exactly where it belongs. Daenerys kept her hand on his. He kept his eyes on the city. They stayed until the stars were fully out, neither of them speaking because there was nothing left to say that wasn't already present in the air between them, in the 20 years of it, in all of it. And then, because the morning always comes and with it the work, they went inside. There would be a small council session in the morning. There would be a dispute about grain distribution in the Riverlands, and a question about the new judicial charter, and a letter from the Iron Bank that required careful handling, and 100 other things that were the actual business of ruling a realm. There would be Ghost in the morning light and Regal on the ramparts, and Missandei's efficient assessment of the day's schedule and Tyrion's opinions about all of it, at length with wine. There would be the city below, enormous and alive and requiring attention, learning slowly what it was like to be governed by someone who thought about the people in it rather than the story it told about its rulers. There would be ravens from the north, from Ned Stark, learning the habit of correspondence, and from Winterfell, where Sansa was already the finest regional administrator in the realm and knew it without needing to say it, and from Arya, whose letters were brief and informative and occasionally contained sentences that made Aemon laugh out loud, which Arya had apparently intended. There would be all of it, the long work of it. The ordinary, extraordinary daily work of people who have decided to try to make things better and have been given, against considerable odds, the opportunity to try. This is what they had sailed toward. This is what the fire had not burned. This is what endured.